Hello there, and welcome to the planet's memory, a place where science drifts at the same gentle pace as waves, and where questions are allowed to wander without the need for certain answers. Tonight, we begin with a thought that has lingered in quiet corners of human imagination for centuries. What if the oceans were not a border of Earth, but its very beginning? What if water was not only surface and shore, but the true womb of the planet, the first archive of time, the first mirror we ever belonged to? At first, it sounds like poetry or myth, or the kind of story told only to soothe a restless mind before sleep. But if you let it rest within you for long enough, if you sit with the pulse of the sea in silence, it begins to feel less like fantasy and more like a question worth leaning into. Perhaps you are listening from far inland, where water feels like a memory instead of a presence. Or perhaps you are close to the coast, where the faint taste of salt can still linger on the wind. Wherever you are, there has likely been a moment where you stood over water and wondered, not about the fish or the weeds or the shifting ripples we can see, but about what lies beyond the reach of light, beneath the silence, in the realms where even sound begins to fade into pressure. It is easy to imagine the sea as an emptiness. But what if it is not emptiness at all? What if the sea, from the very beginning, has been everything, the container that allowed Earth to breathe, remember, even dream? Scientists tell us that water arrived early, though its story is still cloaked in shadows. Some say it seeped from within, from deep minerals hidden in Earth's mantle. Others whisper of icy visitors, comets and asteroids crumbling into vapor as they struck the young world. However it came, once here, water did what it always does. It filled, it covered, it shaped. The earliest surfaces of Earth were softened, erased, reimagined by oceans that never stood still. Even rock, the hardest story Earth can tell, began to dissolve when touched by salt. In that endless dissolving, memory itself seemed to take form. Not fixed, but fluid, not sharp, but slow. When you think of time as a clock, it feels fast. Moments tick away and we chase them. But in the ocean, time does not tick. It drifts. It swells. It loops back on itself. Fossil shells sinking into sand, heat rising from fractures in the crust, ash falling into waves after volcanoes. These become pages. Not separate pages, but layers pressed and pressed again into a book too vast for our eyes to hold. Beneath miles of shifting water, the ocean's basin becomes a recorder of deep time. A whispering vault where every isotope of oxygen, every grain of silt, writes down what the sky once felt like, what the land once breathed. In the ocean, even silence is full of voices. We tend to think of memory as something delicate, easily lost. But oceans tell us otherwise. Their patience surpasses even stone. A mountain, once raised, will one day break apart under rain. But the rains themselves are always carried back to the sea. Civilizations rise, mark their shores with harbors and lights, only to be pulled inward by tides that carry ruins and fragments into darkness. Still, the sea remembers, not in detail but in substance, not in story but in trace. Plastics, shells, isotopes, fragments, all carried forward into entropy, where nothing is ever truly lost, only changed and dispersed. Like thoughts that fade but never vanish completely, water never forgets. And perhaps, if we look with wonder, we might ask, is it possible the sea has known us longer than we have known ourselves? After all, our first breath came from water. Our first cells floated in it, fed by it, divided by it. Even the salt of our blood echoes the sea that made us. In this way, each of us carries an ocean inside, smaller but no less ancient, flowing still with tides older than any map or memory. Maybe when we stand at the shore and feel that strange pull, the calm, the awe, the hunger, we are not just watching water. We are recognizing something of ourselves. If oceans could speak, what language would they use? Would it be the crash of waves against cliffs, or the near silence of trenches where no sun has ever reached? Would they speak in isotopes, numbers hidden in shells, or in the faint traces of carbon and dust settled mile after mile across the seabed? Or would they speak in something simpler, something quieter, just the patience of returning tides, reminding us again and again that time is not a line but a rhythm? Even now, as continents drift, as ice comes and goes, as the crust reshapes itself, the sea endures. What it loses in land, it gains in memory. What it buries, it also preserves. Oceans tell us the story of impermanence not to frighten, but to remind us that impermanence is the way of all things. We are only one more ripple in a book already so full of silenced pages. And yet, in silence, there is comfort. To know that, in the end, everything returns to water, and in that returning, nothing is truly gone. And yet, if this much can be remembered in water, what else might it keep hidden, just beneath the currents of time? Perhaps the answer lies in something so small, so ordinary, that we almost forget its presence. Salt. Not the scattered grains we dust across food, but the vast, invisible fingerprint that lives inside every ocean, every river mouth, every trace of sweat on our own skin. Salt is not just seasoning. It is memory itself. It carries with it the old whispers of vanished seas, the boiling breath of vents erupting at the seafloor, the vapor of a young planet still cooling. When you place a drop of ocean water on your tongue, what you taste is not only the present, but the subtle archive of billions of years. Sodium, chlorine, magnesium, sulfur, calcium, each element carrying the echo of long-dead volcanoes, of mountains eroded to dust, of rivers dragging minerals toward the waiting sea. And because ocean water evaporates and leaves its salt behind, it becomes thicker with age, more concentrated with history. Over eons, the sea has gradually been writing itself denser, line by line, the particles of its autobiography impossible to erase. Salt was here when the first continents cracked apart and the first shallow basins filled. Salt draped itself across evaporating pools, hardening into white plains that still rest under deserts today. These silent salt flats, stretching under sun and star, are nothing less than the fossilized breath of lost oceans. Time itself crystallized into brittle rock, waiting for us to look closer. Geologists can read these layers like a library, each crystal a quiet account of ancient water that once covered lands we can barely imagine. And within those accounts, isotopes tell their truth. Oxygen ratios revealing whether climates were warm or hostile, carbon traces sketching out the atmosphere of forgotten ages. Salt is a witness to entropy, not because it resists change, but because it endures change so completely. The seas lose water to the sky, but the minerals stay, marking every cycle, every rainstorm, every drought. What evaporates might vanish, but what remains is what has always remained. Maybe that is the deep secret of salt. It does not keep history as a complete picture, but as fragments, as shards of an unfinished puzzle. It leaves just enough for us to follow, but never enough to say the story is whole. And so we ask, when you stand by the shore, are you tasting only the present tide? Or are you tasting the residue of oceans so old they held no fish, no plants, no continents warmed by forests? Could it be that within this mineral code, the earth has left us its earliest script? Less language than chemistry, less story than sensation? Perhaps we've been reading it all along, breathing it in our blood, carrying it in the salt-lined rivers of our veins. We are not apart from the sea's archive. We are written into it. Imagine for a moment that the seas themselves could dissolve us in the same way they dissolve mountains. Imagine a future where our artifacts, our cities, our very bones, are broken down by water and absorbed into the endless brine. One day, long after we are gone, the oceans will not tell someone who we were in full, but they will tell that something once was here, that in the time of this salt, there was also dust shaped into people, moving along the edges of the shore, leaving behind their fragile traces. Salt is, in its own way, both the wound and the healer. Corrodes yet preserves, erodes yet remembers. Bones can turn to dust, but in saline brines they may fossilize, suspended for hundreds of millions of years in an embrace so quiet it feels eternal. This twin nature, destructive and protective, makes salt a paradox, and paradox has always been Earth's favorite form of memory. When you taste salt, when you brush a crystal between your fingers, you are holding time itself. Not just time as we know it on a clock, but deep time, cycles of evaporation and flooding, oceans opening and closing, mineral trails running through the veins of the planet. Salt, in its stillness, is a reminder that the ocean's memory is not carried only in waves, but in every quiet residue left behind as worlds change. And yet, if salt is the script, if the ocean has written itself into memory through minerals and residues, then perhaps the heat beneath the waves is the ink, the fire that keeps the story alive. Deep below the surface, where the pressure folds water into something heavier than we can imagine, there are places where heat bursts upward from the planet itself. Hydrothermal vents, like hidden chimneys, releasing water so rich in minerals and energy that it leaves behind entire landscapes of ash towers and black smoke. To us, they look alien. Structures glowing faintly in the dark, plumes rising in silence where no sun has ever fallen. Yet in that alienness, there is something strangely familiar, as though this might be the oldest part of Earth we've ever touched. Here, rock and water no longer feel like separate domains. They talk to each other, exchange their secrets, rewrite themselves in strange chemistries. The vents spew water heated to near boiling, rich with sulfur and metals leached straight from the crust. And within those chemical clouds, something extraordinary happened long ago. Life began to stir, not with sunlight, not with air, but with energy from vents that whispered directly out of Earth's molten heart. To imagine this is to imagine a world before plants, before continents, before breath itself, where life, our deepest ancestor, was perhaps nothing more than a fragile bubble of carbon clinging to heat. Is it possible, then, that we owe our existence not to light but to darkness? Not to the sky but to the depths? We are used to thinking of life as green, radiant, photosynthetic, but maybe our roots are black, sulfurous, mineral. Maybe our first libraries were not forests, but these vent fields, where chemistry arranged itself into memory, and memory arranged itself into being. The lines between geology and biology blur until they almost disappear. A vent is a wound in the planet, yes, but also a cradle. It destroys the ocean around it, yet nurtures entire ecosystems found nowhere else. Out of entropy, creation. Out of fire, continuity. Scientists call these sites black smokers. But the term feels too small for places so immense in their meaning. Around them grow communities of creatures that look improbable against the darkness. Eyeless shrimp, tube worms taller than a person, pale crabs picking along the vent chimneys as if they were ruins of some lost city. Life that thrives not on sun, but on chemistry alone. To watch them is to glimpse resilience in its rawest form, organisms shaped not by light, but by necessity, carving existence from a chemistry most thought could never support life. And when we look closer, we find isotopic trails here too, clues in the very atoms of how ancient water met ancient stone. Those ratios reveal forgotten cycles of the planet's crust, how minerals are swallowed back into the mantle, and then returned in new forms. Hydrothermal vents, in their silence, reveal how nothing is wasted. What is subducted returns. What is lost is not gone, but remade. The rock exhales heat, and water listens. Water absorbs what stone offers, and in return, it offers a stage for life. Once again, the planet remembers itself not in words, but in exchanges, rock to water, water to life, life to sediment, sediment back into stone. Entropy lives here too, yet twisted into renewal. Not because entropy creates disorder, but because within that disorder, new forms can emerge. We often think of collapse as the end of something, but the vents remind us, endings and beginnings are the same event seen from different directions. Maybe you could even say that life itself is the universe's refusal to let entropy be final, each molecule choosing for a moment to resist scattering, to hold shape, to try before dissolving again. To lie awake and imagine these vent worlds is to sink into an atmosphere beyond air. A realm where silence does not mean emptiness, but pressure. Where darkness does not mean absence, but possibility. Down here, the planet is always speaking, but never in a language we fully understand. Instead, it leaves us with questions. What if chemistry was never separate from memory, but its first form? What if these vents were not just beginnings of life on Earth, but beginnings of a pattern we might find on other worlds, under other oceans, beneath other stars? Sometimes we wonder if the ocean is alive in its entirety, if it feels what moves within it. And if so, perhaps hydrothermal vents are like its pulse, the deep rhythmic surges that keep it breathing slow and steady over billions of years. We will never hear them, but if we did, maybe they would sound less like roaring fire and more like heartbeat. And yet, if such hidden furnaces deep below could awaken life in the darkness, what might the long patience of water itself be capable of shaping? For water, unlike fire, does not shout. It does not announce itself with sudden drama. It waits. It softens. It slips into cracks so small that time itself can barely measure their opening. Grain by grain, drop by drop, it works on mountains that once seemed eternal. Peaks erode into foothills, cliffs into sand, granite into dust carried downstream. And every motion, every soft wearing away, is done with quiet persistence that makes even stone surrender eventually. We often picture rivers as moving places, rushing currents, glinting light, the audible sound of flow. But in truth, rivers are simply messengers. They do not keep what they carry. They do not cling to stones or to soil or to fragments of bone swept away in flood. They deliver all of it back to the same ancient receiver, the sea. Whether through a stream no wider than your hand or through a river as vast as an empire, water has only one direction, only one destination. It is a courier for geology, returning Earth to ocean so patiently, so endlessly, that we might mistake this cycle for permanence. But really, it is impermanence itself being revealed, slowly enough for us to witness but too vast for us to stop. Consider a mountain. When new, it is ragged, sharp, full of edges carved upward by tectonic violence. But water waits along its flanks, falling as rain, slipping as ice, running as streams. The salts within it dissolve minerals, the force within it moves rocks, and what we see as grandeur is reduced to fragments small enough to be sand. The ocean does not create mountains, but it collects them, piece by piece, awaiting their return. This is why some say the continents are only temporary. They seem solid, but in truth they are always dissolving into the patient embrace of the sea. In the sediments of the ocean floor, the stories of vanished landscapes accumulate. Every floodplain, every forest-covered hillside, even every city that erodes, is ultimately reduced to particles that drift and settle beneath waves. These are not random fragments. They are chapters, collected in order, pressed without sound into new stone that will one day return to land again. Geologists find in these sediments the signs of ancient rivers, pollen from vanished plants, traces of storms that fell long before humans ever dreamed of recording weather. Water does not rush to keep memories. It allows them to sink slowly, layering one upon another, archives as deep as time itself. It is easy to overlook this erosion, because it does not move at the pace of our lives. A person can watch a cliff for a lifetime and never notice its line retreating. But stand far enough back in time, across millions of years, and the cliff is no cliff at all, just a story half erased. This is what patience means to the ocean. Not minutes, not hours, not centuries, but geological epochs. Long enough for entire species to appear and vanish. Long enough for the very outlines of continents to change. What appears permanent is only slow change disguised as stillness. And yet the patience of water is not cruel. It does not erase completely, transforms. The dust of one mountain becomes the fertile floor of another shore. The silt of one river valley settles into seabed, where it may press into stone cradling fossils. Even decay is returned in some form. Records pressed and hidden, waiting until human curiosity digs and remembers. Perhaps this is why we find bone and leaf, shell and tooth still speaking to us millions of years later. Not because they resisted decay, but because water took them with gentleness into its folds, layering them where pressure, heat, and time could turn fragility into permanence. If we follow the water long enough, we discover entropy disguised as beauty. The second law of thermodynamics tells us everything moves toward dispersal, toward spreading out. Water shows us how. It spreads what is high to what is low, carries what is solid into what is fluid. It moves heat, it moves salt, it moves mountains until nothing is left sharp and proud. And yet, in this dispersal, life itself was nourished. Rivers carrying dissolved rock gave food to plankton, which exhaled oxygen. Floods that destroyed also enriched. The patience of water is not only an act of erosion, but an act of generosity. Perhaps that is why we still stand at riversides, transfixed by their movement. Somewhere in us, we know that this is not merely water passing by, but time passing by, memory passing by. A fragment of a mountain now flowing into an unseen ocean, completing the same journey everything must take one day. Could it be that when we listen to rivers, we are listening to the echoes of our own eventual return, our own scattering, our own surrender to something larger? And yet, if rivers are only messengers, carrying the memories of mountains, where do those memories finally rest once they sink into the seabed? Often, they come to settle in quiet places, in shallow seas where the water moves more slowly, where silt and sand collect in layers so fine that even the smallest fragments of life can be cradled between them. In these hushed environments, bones and shells, once carried away by time's gentle couriers, are laid down gently and covered over, sealed into the silence of stone. This is where fossils sleep, not as grand monuments meant to last forever, but as whispers, as echoes of tides that once moved across landscapes we can no longer see. A fossil is more than stone. It is an argument against forgetting. Every shell pressed into sandstone, every ripple frozen in silt, carries within it a fragment of a world that believed itself lost. Most of these worlds were not dramatic. They were ordinary lives. Fish darting in the shallows, corals building colonies, plants swaying in currents of light. Yet when sand covers them and water hardens their outlines, they become something else. A quiet geometry of memory, written so slowly that no living eye ever saw the transformation. What you hold as a fossil in your hand is not bone anymore, not shell, not leaf. It is minerals that have accepted the shape of what once was living, shadows set into stone, time's attempt at permanence. The slow work of fossilization is patience beyond measure, patience that stretches across epochs. First comes burial, grain by grain. Then comes pressure, pressing sediments into rock, pressing tissues into absence. Water moves through, carrying dissolved minerals, filling spaces where flesh has vanished, creating replicas so delicate they can capture the ridges of a feather or the veins of a leaf. To the stone, the life itself is gone, dissolved completely into entropy. Yet in that absence, a new shape remains, not life, but the memory of its outline. We are reminded that nothing truly endures, and yet, somehow, outlines of things find ways to echo long after the original has vanished. And fossils do not simply preserve species. They preserve tides, atmospheres, climates. A trilobite encased in sandstone carries, within its very stone, the signature of seawater chemistry from that moment. The oxygen isotopes trapped in its shell reveal temperatures of oceans long vanished. In the ratio of carbon, we glimpse what the air was like when that creature breathed. Each fossil is a capsule of environmental memory, a record of the Earth thinking itself through cycles of warmth, collapse, and survival. What seems like silence in stone is in fact the most articulate archive. Could it be, then, that fossils are not simply remnants of the past, but dialogues carried across time? That when we read them, we are not just looking backwards but engaging with Earth itself in conversation. The sandstone does not lie. It does not embellish. Simply holds, waits, reveals itself when we choose to look. Perhaps this is why fossils feel so human to us, because they exist at the same fragile boundary between life and disappearance, permanence and erasure, memory and forgetting. Most creatures that ever lived never fossilized. Their bodies returned swiftly to the cycles of decay, scattered to the waves, consumed by others, dissolved back into the fabric of the planet. Only a minute fraction was given the strange protection of burial, pressure, mineralization. And so the fossil record is both gift and absence, a reminder of what we have, and a haunting of all we will never find. For every skeleton pressed into sandstone, there are countless lives that vanished without leaving a trace, entire ages of creatures erased. The truth of geology is that preservation is an exception, not the rule. We know the world not by its fullness, but by its fragments. And when we trace these fragments, we learn just how much silence surrounds us. The vast gaps in the fossil record are spaces where memory has been lost entirely, as if entire chapters of time were swallowed and never written down. Could it be that Earth chooses what it will remember, selectively, allowing us only glimpses, fragments, suggestions, shadows? Or maybe forgetting itself is the natural rhythm, and fossils are not the rule of memory, but the rare reverie, the occasional dream caught before morning. To hold a fossil is to hold many things at once. To hold weight and also absence. To hold presence and also silence. It is to hold a lineage of decay that somehow led to preservation, a pattern where entropy was slowed long enough for shape to remain. Fossils remind us that memory requires pressure, patience, and above all, burial. Perhaps we too, in our ways, rely on sediments that cover us, voices that press around us, layers of experience that someday might leave impressions, however faint, of who we were. Is it possible, then, that we are fossils in the making? That in some deep future, the river sands of our cities, the bones of our species, may lie captured in rocks waiting to be rediscovered? We may imagine ourselves forgotten, erased by the enormity of time, yet water and sediment have shown again and again that nothing escapes completely. Maybe not our names, not our faces, not our words, but outlines, shadows, traces pressed into stone. And yet, if stillness and burial are what preserve memory, what happens to those records when the ocean floor itself does not stay still, but sinks, shifts, and vanishes back into Earth's molten interior? The truth is that the ocean is never only surface and depth, never only wave and silence. It is motion folded into motion, currents weaving across not only water, but rock beneath. Time itself seems to travel here, carried not just in flows of salt and temperature, but in the restless breathing of tectonic plates. Beneath the continents we walk upon, deep beneath the waves, the very fabric of the ocean floor is born, widened, and swallowed again. To see the sea as still is only illusion. In truth, it is a vast machine of erasure and renewal. At the mid-ocean ridges, molten rock rises like slow fire, hidden under miles of water, yet creating landscapes of newborn crust. Ridge after ridge marks where the planet is stretching open, forming fresh seafloor from Earth's own interior. For a time, that crust bears the sediments falling from above, dust, shells, fossils, the faint records of oceans and skies. Layers collect over millions of years, quietly recording climates, extinctions, blooms of life, and sudden losses. But the ocean floor does not keep them forever. For as it spreads outward, it is also traveling toward its undoing, journeying ever closer to the trenches where it bends and breaks, sliding downward back into darkness. The floor of the sea, the page on which history writes itself, is torn loose, crumpled under the weight of continents, and drawn into the mantle where memory dissolves in heat. What does it mean, then, that Earth remembers but never keeps her surfaces whole? That the archives we seek are always partial, always incomplete, scattered across basins too vast for us to read in one lifetime? Perhaps the most haunting truth is that most of Earth's history is gone. Not because it was never written, but because it was recycled. The crust itself is impermanent, rewritten again and again in cycles that leave only fragments. Deep time is not a book carefully stored, but a library endlessly crumbling and rebuilt from its own dust. The currents themselves participate in this cycle. They are not only streams of water carrying heat and salt across hemispheres. In their slow circulation they carry memory, redistributing traces across the globe. Nutrients from polar upwellings drift toward the tropics. Carbon pulled into the sea during ancient blooms resurfaces centuries later. In this circulation, the ocean becomes not only messenger but composer, rewriting the chemistry of the atmosphere, modulating climate with pulses of heat and cool, serving as Earth's long, slow breath. The planet inhales carbon, tides of plankton flourish and sink, the air clears, and then, centuries later, the ocean exhales what it once took in. To watch currents is to watch time not as a straight line, but as a rhythm across centuries, millennia, entire epochs. Imagine standing at a shore and feeling that each wave before you is part of a pulse that may have begun centuries ago, when water in another hemisphere cooled and descended into darkness, only now returning to light. The ocean's memory is not local. It is global and it is patient. A molecule of water can drift for 1,000 years before resurfacing, having carried with it the chemistry of places half a world away. Time does not move here with hours or even centuries, but with loops that exceed entire civilizations. Could it be, then, that while we measure history in kings and wars, the ocean measures it in circulations, in complete journeys of currents that tie centuries together, uniting the now with the impossibly distant past? And while water cycles through these rhythms, the floor it moves across is disappearing. Trenches open like scars, swallowing entire ages of sediment, records pressed into rock erased back into fire. The fossils, the isotope trails, the shells of plankton, all drawn under, lost except for the faint scraps that happen to survive on continental margins. Most of Earth's memory does not survive through preservation, but through loss. Maybe that is why the sea feels so much like forgetting. Carries history, yes, but lets most of it vanish, dissolved in entropy. What remains, as with fossils, is only fragments, only enough to remind us that memory is never complete. And yet we still listen, because even incomplete, the ocean's cycles reveal profound truths. They teach us that permanence is only illusion, that what we trust is stable. The floor beneath seas, the shorelines beneath our feet, is part of a dance between emergence and disappearance. They remind us that time is not about what endures, but what transforms. Continents travel, oceans open and close, ridges build, trenches consume, and through it all, life finds ways to press outlines of itself into fleeting pages of stone. If the floor beneath the ocean can vanish, and if its sediments can be swept into the mantle's fire, then perhaps there are whole ages of life we will never know. Lost forests, lost creatures, lost skies, civilizations that might have left no trace. The cycles of deep time are not only geology. They are forgetting disguised as renewal. And yet, if so much can be erased, if even the seafloor cannot hold its memory forever, what remains of those cataclysms? The extinctions, the collapses, the hidden records Earth still keeps in black archives beneath our feet? To find them, we must look not at mountains or continents, but at sediments lying quietly at the bottom of ancient seas. Each layer, pressed soft as pages, is time-preserved. With long tubes that reach down through miles of compacted silt, scientists draw up cores of the ocean floor. Held within them are histories older than any human word, tapestries woven of dust, shells, and microscopic signatures invisible to the eye. They are the black archives of Earth, books without language, holding stories of silence, catastrophe, and slow renewal. In these slender cylinders of sediment, we can trace icy cycles that advanced and withdrew like tides on a scale far beyond human perception. Bands rich in oxygen isotopes reveal when ice sheets thickened, locking away water for tens of thousands of years, lowering oceans and redrawing shorelines. Then, other bands record the ice retreat, seas rising again, coastlines drowned. From darkness, we learn that Earth has lived through repeated transformations far larger than the floods and tempests we fear today. Perhaps this is why the planet seems indifferent to our measure of time, because it breathes in thousands of years, and its memory unfolds in strata rather than seconds. And when mass extinctions swept across the biosphere, sediments recorded those moments too. A layer suddenly enriched with iridium hints at the impact that ended the reign of dinosaurs. Another band, blackened with organic carbon, speaks of seas that lost their breath entirely, turning anoxic, suffocating whole ecosystems at once. These thin lines, sometimes no thicker than a page, carry the weight of events that remade all life on Earth. Imagine how fragile memory can be, that entire forests, legions of creatures, whole landscapes of sound and motion might rest in something only millimeters thick, a smudge of darkness between lighter sands. And yet, that is memory's way. It condenses, it compresses, it leaves fragmentary traces rather than complete stories, so that what survives is not detail but shadow. Dust, too, leaves its record. Carried across continents by winds, It finally settles into oceans where it is buried in silence. In dust we find the ashes of ancient volcanoes, pollen from forests no longer standing, iron from deserts long since shifted in place. Dust is perhaps the most democratic of storytellers, because it carries pieces of everywhere to the same final archive, the seafloor. And when scientists read its grains, they can reconstruct not only local climates but global connections. To think that the Sahara's wind can speak across oceans, to think that the whisper of forests reduced to pollen can survive beneath ice caps, is to recognize that nothing truly stands alone. Every environment leaves signals in every core. The ocean ties them all together, pressing them into that black memory where catastrophe and calm overlap. If we pause long enough, these sediments begin to look less like geology and more like philosophy. They remind us that catastrophe is never final, that renewal sleeps beneath collapse, that time is less an arrow than a pattern repeating itself with variation. With every darkened layer of extinction comes another stratum of rebirth. Plankton return, coral regrows, new species emerge. Maybe the archives are not only written for us, but written for the earth itself, like a mirror it holds to its own face as it changes. Could it be that the planet writes these records not only to keep track of climates and lives, but to remind itself what resilience looks like? And yet, we cannot escape the silences that haunt the record. Even in these cores, what they carry is only partial, broken, a few thousand places sampled across an ocean that covers most of the planet. Of all the stories Earth has told, we are allowed only glimpses, thin slices through darkness where most pages are missing. Perhaps that is part of the dreamlike nature of the Black Archives. They remind us not just of what we know, but of how much we will never know, how silence and loss are part of memory itself. Deep beneath, the archives keep both imprint and erasure, like a journal that has pages deliberately removed. Could hidden within them be traces of ages more mysterious still? Ancient civilizations whispered of but not proven, technofossils pressed into sediments waiting for discovery, tales of eras erased so deeply they return only in questions? Maybe, maybe not. The ocean does not reveal itself completely. It opens one layer, then guards another. It shows us collapse, then conceals what came before. Always partial, always suggestive, never whole. To drift into this thought is to feel both awe and humility. How every grain that falls, every shell that sinks, becomes part of an unknowable memory larger than us. And so we learn again the lesson Earth continues to whisper, that memory is not a fixed thing, but a tide itself, receding, advancing, sometimes giving, sometimes withholding. What survives in the Black Archives is enough to remind us that history itself might be nothing more than sediments layering upon one another, awaiting a reader who may never come. And yet, if even silence can be stored in dark archives, then what shall we call the spaces between cataclysms? The long gaps where loss gives way to quiet, where time leaves almost nothing at all. It is easy to imagine Earth's history as one long procession of drama. Meteors striking, volcanoes erupting, oceans choking with carbon. But when we look deeper, most of time holds no such spectacle. It is filled instead with stillness, with intervals where nothing seemingly happens, and yet everything is slowly erased. The waters have buried 95% of all creatures that ever lived, not in catastrophe, but in silence. Not because they were violently undone, but because they simply disappeared without leaving a fossil, without carving their names into strata, without finding a way to resist the slow currents of entropy. Picture the weight of that silence. Billions of tiny creatures turning to nothingness, their fragile bodies dissolving in currents, their outlines never pressed into stone. Whole lineages lost not because Earth chose to destroy them, but because it did not bother to remember them. Sediments layered over oceans full of life, yet only fractions survive as impressions. A vertebra here, a leaf traced there, a tooth gleaming out of shale. For every fossil we admire, there are countless beings who left no record, whose existence is only hinted at in the gaps. Could it be that the fossil record speaks to us more in absences than in presences? Could it be that Earth's memory is not complete, but fractured, leaving us haunted by all that will remain unknown? When scientists bore into rocks and find long stretches of emptiness, Intervals where little is preserved, they call them unconformities. Missing chapters of Earth. Entire epochs lost in erosion, subduction, dissolution. In those gaps, silence reigns. Not the silence of nothing, but the silence of forgetting. Maybe those are the most honest parts of the record, the moments that tell us history is not accumulation but loss. Perhaps Earth remembers the way humans do, not by holding every detail, but by carrying fragments, by keeping only what was pressed the deepest while the rest drifts away. And yet, silence is not barren. Tells its own story. In oxygen isotopes, we hear climates shift. In the chemistry of carbonates, we glimpse sudden warmth or cooling that drifted across entire hemispheres. In faint residues of pollen found in core samples, we find a whisper of forests bending to breezes that no longer exist. The silence between cataclysms is filled with subtle signals, too easily overlooked, but stacked upon one another, they reveal Earth's quieter rhythms. Not every change is loud. Not every shift is destructive. Much of the planet's story has been written in gradual transitions, invisible in a single lifetime, but immense across deep time. If we let ourselves sink into that awareness, silence becomes a kind of comfort. To know that even among extinction events, even among upheaval, there are vast stretches of calm. Oceans simply carrying salt, winds drifting dust, continents quietly eroding. Perhaps more things pass away in quiet than in violence. Maybe death more often arrives as drift and burial than as destruction. The silence between cataclysms helps us see that the end of most worlds is not fire, but silt. Not noise, but stillness. And yet, that stillness carries questions back to us. How much of history is already gone before it begins? How many civilizations of organisms rose and fell with no fossil, no trace, no word left behind? Could there have been creatures with stories more intricate than we imagine, whole experiments of life dissolved before they could be preserved? Maybe we are not only shaped by memory, but also by forgetting that we exist in a lineage of shadows as much as truths. Perhaps Earth has carried countless lives in silence, lives that remain unknown not because they were unremarkable, but simply because memory is selective, and silence is easier than keeping everything. In this way, silence itself becomes part of Earth's identity. It is not a failure of preservation, but a reminder of impermanence. The ocean buries, erases, and renews, ensuring that the majority of the world's stories are never read. And maybe that is the balance. Not everything is meant to endure. Some things belong to silence as much as others belong to stone. And yet, if silence hides so much of what once lived, then what meaning can we draw from the records that do remain? Some are shells, some are bones, some are isotopes sleeping quietly in rock. But now, in our own age, the ocean records something new, stranger, sharper, and unmistakably ours. Today, fragments of plastic drift like the new ammonites of another age. Oceans, once womb, now archive not just life, but us. Float for a moment in that thought. Tiny microplastics, lighter than dust, already rest in the bellies of fish, in the ice that blooms around Antarctica, in sediments raining downward to the darkest trenches. They lie there among ancient diatoms, among fossils of plankton, among volcanic ash that once marked eruptions thousands of years old. We have written ourselves into the archives, not with bone or leaf, not with fossilized outline, but with polymers and metals, signatures that nature did not intend. Could it be that these will be the most enduring fossils of our time? That long after our languages fade, long after our cities rust, the ocean floor will hold small threads of plastic as proof of our brief presence? Scientists call them technofossils, the new strata of the Anthropocene, an age shaped less by shifting ice or volcanic fire, and more by human hands. Aluminum that will not corrode, glass that resists decay, plastic too young for bacteria to know how to break. Already these traces collect in layers, settling alongside the old records, symbols neither biological nor geological, but something hybrid, something that blurs the ancient line between nature and technology. Maybe it is strange comfort, maybe unease, but we already live among our fossils in the making. Entropy tells us nothing resists forever, and yet the things we fashion by chance of chemistry may resist longer than we will. A bag, a bottle, a tire fragment. They, not us, may be the storytellers of our time. Imagine 100 million years from now, the seafloor lifted as new mountain ranges, a geologist of some future intelligence tracing thin bands of microplastic as we now trace bands of iridium or soot. Would they wonder who we were? Would they guess from the fragments scattered like strange shells in stone? Or would they see only another extinction pulse? Another shadow of an age that rose too quickly and ended too soon? What makes it haunting is how unintentional this archive is. We do not choose to be remembered in this way. Fossils of bone and shell are accidents of circumstance. Our technofossils are accidents of excess. Not deliberate inscriptions, but side effects, like fingerprints left on glass. Perhaps the ocean, indifferent as ever, simply gathers what is given. Dust once from deserts, pollen once from forests, and now plastic threads small enough to slip into every tide. The sea remembers everything not because it chooses to, but because it has no choice. And yet, there is a strange symmetry to it. Once, ammonites swirled in seas thick with life, their shells leaving spirals pressed elegantly into stone. Today we leave bottle caps and microbads, not elegant but unmistakable. They too will be molded into rock, into future sandstone conglomerates, sealed with time's pressure. Future ages might carve their own myths from our residues. Perhaps to them, our traces will seem symbols, hieroglyphs from a vanished civilization who left behind endless fragments but never a full story. The irony is we did not design these to last, but now they may last the longest. The ocean does not judge what becomes archive, takes in what flows, folds it into sediment, presses it into record. A coral reef dies, its skeleton turns into limestone. A plastic fragment sinks alongside, becoming part of the same stone. Life and artifact, decay and invention, blended until one can hardly be told from the other. What story will this mingling tell? Perhaps none. Perhaps all it will say is that water remembers indiscriminately, that the archive of Earth is as much trash as treasure, as much silence as story. It is a gentle kind of humility to realize that our truest legacy may not be the words we leave or the monuments we build, but what drifts unnoticed on currents too vast to control. Maybe millions of years from now, no ruins of our cities will survive, no books, no screens, no signals. But the ocean floor might still hold our presence in layers, quiet, unavoidable, waiting as all layers wait. And yet, if the ocean now holds us too, if our fingerprints already press into the black archives of sediment, what will it mean for the tides that rise and fall in our own lifetimes? To see the answer, we must look to the ice. For ice is not stillness, but rhythm. Glaciers melt into oceans with a cadence slow enough to feel eternal, yet precise enough to be called breath. Like lungs, the seas inhale and exhale ice, drawing it in during ages of cold, releasing it during ages of warmth. Vast ice sheets advance until they swallow coastlines, then retreat, pouring their memory back into the sea, raising water that redraws maps of the continents. This breathing of ice has shaped the very world we live in now. Valleys once carved by glaciers stretch beneath modern rivers. Rock once buried under miles of frozen weight now lies bare. Each melt is erasure, but also renewal, leaving behind plains rich with sediment, soils ready for life. The sea remembers this pulse, just as our atmosphere remembers it, just as we do in our bones made from calcium once washed by ancient tides. Could it be that all life listens, in some way, to the deep breath of ice? For within its cycle lies the fragility of things we call permanent. Cities, coastlines, even entire species balance on the rhythm of ice's rise and fall. We imagine our lands as fixed, yet ice shows us they are only temporary shapes drawn upon a breathing world. And the question lingers, quiet but insistent. What happens to us when the seas exhale once more, faster than before, carrying our shores inward, covering our edges step by step? And the question lingers, quiet but insistent. What happens to us when the seas exhale once more, faster than before, carrying our shores inward, covering our edges step by step? To follow that thought takes us deeper, past even the waters and the ice, into the ground beneath our feet. For the lands we call permanent, the continents, the mountains, even the islands rising lonely from the sea, are not fixed at all. They drift, they wander, they rearrange themselves across spans of time longer than we can hold in mind. Plate tectonics is ocean's companion. Continents move apart, then return, splitting and rejoining in cycles vast beyond measure. Beneath them all, oceans are the threads, eternal yet changing, stitching and unstitching the face of Earth. Imagine the memory of a continent if such memory could exist. Once, the land we know as Africa collided with Europe, raising mountains where seas had once stretched. Long before that, it was locked in a supercontinent, fused tightly with every other mass of land into a world called Pangaea. And before Pangaea, there were others: Gondwana, Rodinia, Columbia, names we give to configurations so ancient they exist more in imagination than in direct record. Each supercontinent was temporary. Each broke apart, dissolving into drifting fragments, only to drift again toward reunion in some future age. Could it be, then, that the continents themselves breathe, not with the rise and fall of ice, but with drift, a slower inhaling and exhaling where land pulls away and then folds back over and over again? The pace is slow, but the record is undeniable. Paleomagnetic trails, tiny alignments of iron frozen in rock, show us that continents have shifted position, pointing not where they are now but to poles long vanished. Fossils lend their testimony as well. The same species found on coasts now divided by entire oceans, proof that once those regions touched. It is humbling to think that oceans themselves open and close, that the width of the Atlantic is just a phase, that one day its waters will vanish as continents return. Oceans expand like wounds, then heal like scars, a process so vast that human time dissolves inside it. And yet, if we think of the oceans as memory, and the continents as pages, then plate tectonics is the act of reshuffling the book endlessly. Nothing is kept in order. Sediments accumulated for ages may be driven under in trenches and reborn as stone deep below. Mountain ranges rise, trapping memories of vanished seas inside folded rock. In a single grain of quartz lifted to a mountain peak, one might find the remnants of shells formed in oceans long gone. The land itself is stitched from forgotten tides. There is a slow poetry in this drift. It reminds us that maps are not pictures, but moments, snapshots of a world in flux. The archipelagos we travel to, the shorelines we defend, the mountains we climb, all of these are temporary designs drawn from restless plates. Given enough time, continents are like clouds. They look whole, massive, unyielding, but they will part, reform, and shift again, carrying their identities fluidly across the ages. Could it be that continents themselves are the longest travelers in existence, wandering slowly, always returning but never the same? And quietly, this drifting is part of life's own story. Mountain ridges open at spreading centers, where heat from inside fuels vented oceans, and where life had its earliest trials. Continents colliding lifted mountains, creating climates that shaped species. Sea basins closing rerouted currents, changing the chemistry of skies. The Earth's shifting crust is not background. It is the hand that rearranges conditions for extinction and evolution, for death and renewal. We exist not apart from drift, but because of it. We are consequences of continents, travelers in their wake. If you close your eyes and try to imagine Earth 50 million years from now, the continents will not match what you know today. Africa may move into Europe. The Americas might drift further apart. New ridges will rise. New seas will close. Perhaps someday another supercontinent will gather. As they always have, distant continents drawn back into a new whole. Will there be anyone to notice? Or will it unfold again in silence, unnoticed except by the sediments that someday contain its shadow? Every coastline is temporary, every mountain a ripple, every ocean a thread in progress. The drift of continents shows us that nothing of Earth is stationary. Not ice, not water, not even rock. Everything breathes, everything moves, and while movement means loss, movement also means renewal. This is the endless balancing act of the planet, unfolding at a pace too vast to accompany but too steady to resist. And yet, if even the continents themselves are wanderers, Then what of the oceans hidden below them, locked away under rock and ice, waiting to be discovered? For water is not always where we expect it to be. It is not only in the rivers, the seas, or even drifting as clouds above us. It also sleeps in secret places, trapped beneath the weight of miles of ice, or sealed under layers of crust, never touched by sunlight. These are the hidden lakes below, the shadowed waters that remind us of life's refusal to vanish, its persistent search for existence wherever even the smallest opportunity allows. Beneath Antarctica, in landscapes of cold so brutal they seem eternal, entire lakes glimmer in darkness under more than 2 miles of glacial ice. Lake Vostok is one of them, a body of water sealed off for perhaps 15 million years, untouched, unexposed. There, isolation becomes an experiment in endurance. Cut off from the sky, cut off from fresh nutrients, it holds water warmed faintly by geothermal heat and pressure, cradling mysteries we can only imagine. Do microbes drift in its shadows, waiting for discovery? Could they be remnants of ancient lineages, whispers from eras long before us? The answer remains uncertain, but even the possibility reveals a truth. Water, wherever it hides, always stirs at the edges of renewal. And these hidden reservoirs are not only beneath ice. Deep within the crust, kilometers down in fractures and pores of rock, water circulates in extreme darkness, heated by Earth's persistent interior warmth. Here, too, microbes thrive, not dependent on sunlight, but on chemistry, feeding on hydrogen and sulfur, building quiet metabolisms in stone's deep labyrinth. They are fossils in the making, and yet also rebellions against fossilization, alive in spaces we once believed sterile. Could it be that life never needed the comfort of the surface? That surfaces are only fleeting arenas, while the true endurance of biology lies in these shadowed places, beyond collapse, beyond catastrophe? The patience of these hidden lakes is humbling. They are not the restless tides we know, but archives of stillness. They store not only traces of life, but traces of climate, sealed bubbles of atmosphere locked like time capsules beneath the ice. A drilling core through these frozen shields may reveal the faint chemistry of ancient skies, carbon rising or falling, oxygen whispering of forests long since erased. In this sense, the hidden lakes hold not just biology, but Earth's memory compressed in silence. Waiting for us to notice. Even more haunting is the thought that some of these pockets have existed longer than human history itself. Whole civilizations have risen, written, and collapsed while these waters lay quietly underground, untouched. Within them may be isotopes marking magnetic reversals, or grains of dust blown from deserts now gone. In their separation from the surface, they keep an older truth, that Earth does not need witnesses to remember. Not everything asks for our presence. Some archives resist discovery. Perhaps they even prefer silence. If life persists here, locked under ice or rock, it blurs the boundaries we've placed on possibility. Could life on distant moons, Europa, Enceladus, Titan, be unfolding in the same way, hidden under frozen crusts, never needing sunlight, never reaching for the stars? Earth's hidden lakes become mirrors of those unknown worlds. They whisper that we may not be rare, that elsewhere in the cosmos, shadow waters might also churn with microbes, with beginnings, with patience too slow for us to recognize but endurance too vast to ignore. There is a strange comfort in this, the idea that life finds ways to persist even in exile. Not because conditions are perfect, but because existence itself leans always toward survival. The hidden lakes are proof that even silence can be inhabited, even isolation can be continuity. They remind us that life does not need abundance, it only needs endurance. And so we learn again how memory works on Earth. Not only through fossils, not only through sediments, but through living pockets sealed off, carrying ancient DNA, ancient chemistries, ancient possibilities still in motion. These lakes are alive in ways we do not yet fully know, which is to say, they are memory not as artifact but as ongoing story. And yet, if hidden lakes can preserve both atmosphere and life across millions of silent years, what might we learn by imagining oceans not as they are now, but as they once were, at the very beginning, when water had only just claimed the surface of the planet. Step with me backward into the Archean, for billion years ago, when the earth was young and unsteady, and the seas themselves did not soothe, but simmered. These were not the gentle blue oceans we picture, spread beneath quiet skies. They were hot, restless, churning with volcanic gases, heavy with metals, their heat pressed upward by a planet still shedding its violent birth. In Earth's childhood, the oceans boiled. To imagine those waters is to imagine a crucible, oceans not only as cradle but as testing ground. The air above them was thick with methane and carbon dioxide, a haze that cloaked a weaker sun but trapped heat like a blanket. The seas steamed, sometimes near to the edge of boiling, especially near volcanic vents spitting sulfur and iron into their depths. Lightning flashed through the heavy skies, striking endlessly into the waters. Chemistry churned, and from that churning rose possibility, the loose beginnings of life, assembled from elements stirred by heat, pressure, and energy cycling again and again. Could it be, then, that life itself was sparked not by calm but by fever, not by stillness, but by boiling? We often imagine beginnings as gentle, but perhaps the opposite is true. Entropy, instead of dissolving life's possibility, may have made it inevitable. Bonds form when they are broken and remade many times, and the hot seas offered such repetition. Simple molecules, drawn together, pulled apart, brought together again by tides and vented heat. Maybe this cycling of destruction and renewal was the first kind of memory the planet knew, chemistry rehearsing itself until one pattern, by chance, held long enough to become recognizable as living. In that young world, the oceans were not merely chemical baths, but participants in an extraordinary dialogue between rock, sky, and water. Volcanoes fed them minerals. Atmospheres fed them storms. Lightning brought energy that water carried forward. Slowly, what had been barren crust became complicated. Perhaps those boiling waters held chains of molecules that could copy themselves, imperfectly but persistently enough to survive. Could it be that water's restlessness was the script on which nature wrote its first line? From a distance, it might have looked like chaos. But chaos is not absence of order. It is order not yet seen. The Archean seas wrote their archive in minerals, black shales and greenstone belts that still whisper of heat and sulfur. In their isotopes, carried through rocks billions of years later, we can still trace the signs. Faint ratios of carbon hinting at microbial breath, iron formations recording when oxygen first touched the sea. These whispers are close to silence, nearly erased, as if the earliest story didn't care whether anyone remembered. And maybe it didn't. Maybe memory is always secondary to existence. Yet for us, looking back, the idea is haunting, that the same seas which once boiled and foamed with toxic gases and scarlet iron are the ancestors of the blue oceans we know today. That what was once nearly unlivable has become the home of abundance. There is wonder in knowing that the source of our calm tides is a crucible of fire, that our oceans carry in their depths both soothed memory and scarred beginning. And perhaps this is why the sea feels infinite to us, why standing at its edge evokes such deep stillness. Because somewhere in its water is the chemistry that first gave rise to what we are. Somewhere in it is the record of heat older than continents, older than fossils, older than silence itself. When we walk along a shoreline today, we walk along the cooled version of something that once roared. Is it possible that the ocean remembers even that, its own fevered birth? Maybe every tide is not just the moon's pull, but an echo of its own boiling youth. Maybe each wave rising and breaking is the sea repeating, slowly, the patience it needed to cool, to soften, to make room for us. And yet, if the oceans began as crucibles of fire, what other rhythms of time have they kept since then? What long, slow measures might tides still hold, shaping not only land but time itself? For the seas are not only drifters of salt and keepers of fossils. They are also clocks. Their motion is stirred by a companion in the sky, the moon, whose silent gravity draws the water upward and lets it fall again, endlessly, as if folding Earth into a breathing rhythm. With its tugging, the moon stretches and folds the surface of oceans into long, rising pulses. Each tide is steady, unhurried, almost hypnotic, as though time itself has a metronome, and that metronome is water. We think of time in ticking seconds, in calendars, in gears moving fast enough to see. But the tides measure differently. They move not in moments but in cycles, twice each day, with slight variations that accumulate across centuries and millennia. Each tide is a patient clock, slow enough to lull us into forgetting it is counting at all. Yet with every rise and retreat, energy is exchanged. The moon pulls, Earth resists, and slowly the planet hands its own rotation to its satellite. The length of our day has not always been 24 hours. It was once shorter, and in the distant future will be longer still, all because of tides. Could it be that when we look at waves touching the shore, we are staring not just at water in motion, but at time stretched out and reshaped before our eyes? Fossils themselves keep this rhythm. In the layered muds of tidal flats, ancient stromatolites grew, adjusting to cycles of flooding and retreating seas. Embedded ripple marks trace where water advanced and withdrew, a literal pattern of time pressed into stone. Later, shells record it too. Growth bands accumulating with each tidal pulse, fine lines etched into calcium like the rings of trees. Scientists read these subtle signals with care, and find they tell us that hundreds of millions of years ago, days were shorter, tides moved differently, the moon hovered closer. The very sky, it seems, has drifted away from us through the ocean's relentless pacing. Time is not only kept by clocks, it is kept by tides, in the shifting memory of land and sea. The beauty and strangeness lies in knowing that this rhythm is relentless. It does not tire, does not pause, does not forget. Long after civilizations vanish, tides will continue to move with the moon's quiet hand. They will continue eroding coasts, shaping estuaries, pouring sediments into basins. To the tide, our lives are brief interruptions. To us, the tide is background sound. But in another sense, the tide is the only measure of constancy we have, a reminder that Earth and its companion dance whether or not we exist to witness it. And yet, tides are not only cosmic. They shape us directly. Human settlements have always leaned toward coastlines, knowing the regularity of tides could be trusted. Ancient peoples carved marks, watching the moon and water in careful cycles, learning to fish and harvest by their rhythm. They understood, though they may not have had words for it, that water itself was a clock. Each flood and retreat was measurement, prediction, security. In watching tides, they were sharing in a rhythm as old as Earth's own turning, as infinite as the scarring and stitching of continents. Perhaps this is why to stand at a shoreline is to feel an odd comfort. The pattern is endlessly familiar. Waves rise, waves fall. The edge of the sea advances and retreats as it always has. Nothing new, yet nothing ever repeated exactly. Could it be that the tide's hypnosis is not only aesthetic but existential, that we sense its deeper role as the planet's chronometer, recording the stretch of days, the distance of the moon, the slowing of Earth itself? While our clocks tick toward endings, the tide simply breathes. In this way, tides remind us that time is not human, not narrow, not small. Time encompasses orbits, distances, celestial pulls. It humbles us into remembering that what we call permanence is only rhythm. And so, we might even wonder, are tides not only keepers of time, but teachers of it? Do they remind us that our own perception of time, fast, linear, fleeting, might only be one way of seeing, when in truth, time is cyclical, layered, recursive, like waves eternally folding and unfolding against the shore? And yet, if the tides are Earth's slow clock, what becomes of that clock when the oceans themselves lose their breath, when waters stagnate and fall silent, erasing entire ecosystems beneath their surface? There have been times in Earth's history when the seas did not circulate, when their vital mixing failed, and oxygen disappeared from their depths. These were the anoxic events, silent extinctions in which water became suffocating and whole worlds of creatures collapsed into stillness. Oceans that once teemed with swimming life turned to dark tombs, and the sediments left behind hardened into black shale, pages of stone that now stand as memorials of suffocated eras. To picture these oceans is to imagine not only silence, but weight. Without oxygen, decay slowed, and organic matter sank unbroken to the sea floor, layer after layer, until seabeds grew heavy with the remains of life. Black shales are their memory, dark bands pressed between brighter strata, recording the drowning of ecosystems vast beyond imagining. To hold a piece of the stone today is to hold a mass grave that stretches not over villages or continents, but across entire oceans. It is to hold silence crystallized. And yet, even this silence becomes part of the rhythm. For from the carbon-rich black shales came consequences that reshaped the Earth's climate, drawing down greenhouse gases, cooling the world. Despair and renewal written in the same stone. Life was not destroyed complete. It was rearranged. Some species vanished forever, but others adapted, rose, and radiated into the vacant niches left behind. In the absence of one world, another began to form, shimmering with unfamiliar life. Extinction beneath the surface became womb as well as grave, reminding us that creation and destruction are companions, two faces of the same unfathomable time. Geologists search for the causes of these anoxic oceans. Sometimes they find climate shifts, warming seas that stagnated circulation, leaving oxygen trapped at the surface. Other times it was volcanism, massive outpourings of lava that spewed CO2, altering balances between air and sea. Dust from eruptions fertilized blooms of plankton, whose explosions drew oxygen down so deeply that no other creature could endure. The chemistry of oceans became prison, and creatures left gasping had no way to escape. Could it be that Earth itself occasionally chooses to hold its breath, reshuffling its story when the balance tips too far? And though we call these events disasters, they are disasters from our perspective, not from the planet's. Black shales became new fuel for future worlds, rich with carbon later transformed into the coal and oil that power us now. Strange irony, that the very energy we release back into the atmosphere is drawn from ancient seas that stopped breathing. By burning this memory, we return oxygen's absence to the air, repeating the cycle but faster, less patient, less forgiving. When we think of extinction, our minds often race to violence. Meteors, eruptions, sudden collapse. But extinction beneath the surface was not fast. It was gradual, quiet, and therefore even more haunting. Creatures continued trying to live, not knowing the oxygen that sustained them was drifting away. Day after day, year after year, they moved, fed, reproduced, until one by one the currents turned against them, and they became part of the layer accumulating at the bottom. Silence does not announce itself. It simply folds itself around you until nothing remains but its weight. And still, the black archives show us that loss is not the end. In the ruins of those seas, new species appeared with adaptations unimagined before. Organisms able to tolerate sulfide-rich waters, microbes thriving in absence rather than dying in it. Life bent itself toward survival, refusing to vanish completely. Entropy may scatter, but life, again and again, insists on continuity, on reshaping into forms no one could predict. Out of suffocation came invention. Out of silence came whispers of new beginnings. Perhaps, then, these anoxic oceans are reminders that memory itself includes absence. That to remember honestly is to accept not only presence but loss, not only continuity but void. Memory, like the oceans, does not discriminate. It takes all things, the living, the dead, the silence between, and presses them together, layering them into stone that future beings may read. And so we stand, looking at slabs of black shale, and we do not simply see rock. We see eras suffocated, worlds gone, rebirth threaded through them. We see that nothing, not even collapse, is absolute. And we sense, uncomfortably, that oceans may yet hold such capacity again. Their breath may falter, their silence may deepen, perhaps sooner than we think. And yet, if extinction beneath the surface can bring forth renewal, what other secrets lie hidden in the shells and isotopes of the seas, waiting quietly to whisper their lessons back to us? For within the smallest fragments of ocean life, shells no larger than a grain of sand, there is a subtle language written not in words, but in atoms. Oxygen and carbon, bound to calcium in the skeletons of plankton and mollusks, carry within them delicate ratios, fingerprints of the seas in which they once lived. These are the whispers of isotopes, the chemistry of memory preserved so quietly it is almost invisible. When a creature builds its shell, it does not know it is embedding time. It pulls oxygen from the seawater around it, but the oceans are never constant. Their chemistry is tuned by climate. Warmer waters release lighter isotopes of oxygen. Colder waters hold more heavy ones, shifting the balance ever so slightly. To the creature, this is unconscious. To us, millions of years later, it becomes revelation. In the ratios of oxygen locked into ancient shells, we glimpse warmth, collapse, rebirth. We learn that Earth has swung between hothouse and icebound more times than our stories have ever accounted for. That climates are not stable, but restless, pulsing like a slow tide of temperature and air. Every isotope is a messenger. Oxygen tells us of ice sheets expanding and retreating, of seas rising and drawing back, of long winters and sudden warmths. Carbon isotopes speak of forests breathing, of carbon pulled into roots and trunks, or released in fire and death. Strontium traces mark eruptions, chemical scars from oceans laced with elements leached from young, rising mountains. The isotopes are layered in silence, awaiting futures when someone, curious, listens. Perhaps they are messages not written for us, but messages we have learned to translate nonetheless, allowing us to touch climates far older than imagination. Could it be that isotopes are Earth's most honest storytellers? Unlike memory carved into myth, unlike fossils preserved by chance, isotopes record without intention. They cannot lie. They do not embellish. They simply balance out as chemistry dictates, writing with a precision measured in ratios instead of words. And maybe that is why they strike us with such awe, because in their quiet obedience to physics, they reveal truths of history too large for us to see on our own. Imagine an ice age written in oxygen, peak after peak of isotope curves climbing like frozen mountains on a graph, showing us not only that glaciers advanced, but when, by how much, and how swiftly they melted again. Imagine a sudden collapse caught in carbon levels, revealing the mass death of forests or plankton blooms that swallowed oxygen only to blanket oceans with decay. Each ratio is not just a number. It is an echo of weather, of breath, of living things inhaling and exhaling across epochs. And yet, the whispers of isotopes are incomplete. They tell us warmth, but not how it felt. They reveal collapse, but not who suffered first. What is left out is just as haunting as what is preserved. Isotopes give us the architecture of history without its texture, the skeleton without its voice. Could it be that we will always feel half-blind, decoding numbers into narratives that can never be fully true? And perhaps that too is part of memory. That silence is the larger part, and whispers are all we will ever receive. Still, the whispers are enough to remind us that climate is not a fixed stage, but a restless player. It reshapes oceans, redraws coastlines, rearranges the possibilities of life. What seems unprecedented to us has often played before, though never in quite the same way. Warmth has come and gone. Collapse has come and gone. Renewal has come again like a rhythm too slow to hear. Perhaps the isotopes, in their quiet balance, are teaching us that nothing is final, that every fall carries the seed of rising, every silence a hidden breath. And yet, if the smallest shells can carry within them the memory of climates, what might the ocean itself carry in its entirety? As entropy spreads and nothing is ever kept whole, only dissolved and remade, the ocean teaches us, quietly but relentlessly, that nothing in its expanse is truly lost. Everything that enters it, stone, salt, bone, even our most fragile traces, is shifted, dissolved, or scattered. Entropy lives here not as a theory, but as a daily rhythm. A river delivers its silt, a city sends its fragments, a cliff collapses, a shipwreck rusts, and the sea accepts it all, not to keep, not to treasure, but to scatter into forms unrecognizable, dispersing memory into its endless drift. Entropy is often described as disorder, but in the ocean, it feels more like gentle redistribution. Iron from deserts sails on winds until it rains into the sea, feeding plankton light years away from its source. Ruins fall into depths, but the metals break down, the wood swells and dissolves, the artifacts shift into sediments indistinguishable from natural grains. To entropy, everything is food for scattering. Not because it seeks to destroy, but because it cannot do otherwise. Maybe this is why the ocean humbles us so deeply, because we know that our most permanent creations will become indistinguishable from sand, our proudest legacies scattered into salt and silt. Think of a coastline battered by waves. Not one stone vanishes entirely, but every stone becomes smaller, smoother, rolled endlessly until it is grain. That grain is carried to another shore, merged with others, perhaps pressed in time into new stone. The identity of each fragment is lost, but its substance remains. Could it be, then, that even our memories, when drowned in the ocean, undergo the same fate? Not erased, not destroyed, but diluted into everything else, so diffuse we can no longer name them? It is in this way that entropy becomes the ocean's great storyteller. Not because it keeps stories neatly, but because it ensures no single story remains untouched. A whale dies, sinks to the abyss, and its body becomes colony and feast, dispersed into countless others. A river carries toxins, but the sea dilutes them, scattering the signal across waters so vast that the poison becomes faint echo. Even silence, pressed by sediments, is not silence forever. It becomes new stone, shifted into a different kind of memory. In entropy, loss is never absolute. It is transformation. The deep time of the ocean reveals this again and again. Entire continents have been ground to dust, poured into trenches, subducted into fire, returned as volcanic islands. Their substance still here but rewritten so completely the past is hardly visible. Fossils tell us what was, but entropy tells us why so little remains. The ocean has no need for permanence. It participates in cycles of dispersal. And perhaps that dispersal is the destiny not only of rocks, but of us as well. Every civilization that leans against the shore eventually dissolves into ocean spray and sediment. Cities crumble, metals corrode, words vanish, but their atoms continue, floating onward into other forms, carried forward by water's patient entropy. What if this scattering is not failure, but fulfillment? To exist fully is to dissolve eventually, to lend atoms and fragments back to the sea that bore us. Maybe entropy is not life's opposite, but its natural culmination. Every tide a reminder that nothing can be held in the same place forever. Every wave undoing what it once shaped, pressing us, slowly, into dispersal. Entropy is not cruel, but impartial. It touches everything without discrimination. And yet, in that impartiality lies an odd kind of comfort. For if all rivers end in seas and all memories in dispersal, then we are part of something far larger than our singular narratives. We will become untraceable, yes, but we will endure in diffusion. Not in permanence, but in continuity. A grain of calcium from our bones might drift into ocean water, carried in a current that lasts 1,000 years before surfacing again in a wave. A fragment of iron from our tools may end as sediment pressed into new stone, future geology folded into mountains. Already, entropy has been reminding us. Everything is recycled, nothing vanishes. Perhaps this is the ocean's most profound form of memory, not written in fossils or isotopes, but written in dispersal itself. Still, we cannot avoid the unease of it. To be remembered as fragments that no longer speak of us, to know that identity itself erodes until it becomes indistinguishable from other sediment. This too is the truth of entropy. Could it be that selfhood, too, is temporary, and what survives is only matter and motion, carried far beyond what we ever knew? And yet, if oceans dissolve all memory into scattering, if even civilizations and identities sink into silence, then what of the forgotten shores, those drowned landscapes that still sleep beneath the tides, waiting quietly as echoes of what once was? For the lines where land meets sea have never been fixed. They move, sometimes slowly, sometimes with startling haste, retreating and advancing with the breath of ice, with the tilt of the planet, with the ceaseless rhythm of deep time. Continents once stretched wider than we know them, and oceans once lay narrower, confined by coastlines that no longer exist. To look across the sea now is to stare at water pulled over lands our eyes will never see. The truth is that much of Earth's story has been written on shorelines, and much of that record lies hidden. During the Great Ice Ages, vast amounts of water were locked away in glaciers towering miles high. Oceans retreated hundreds of feet, unmasking valleys and plains now far beneath the waves. Coasts extended outward, connecting islands, binding continents, revealing lands where animals roamed and perhaps even humans walked. When the ice melted, oceans surged back, drowning these places, folding them into silence. What remains are drowned valleys, steep canyons carved by rivers that no longer flow, and the faint outlines of deltas smothered in salt. What lies beneath is not emptiness, but a map erased. Imagine, beneath the North Sea, the Great Plain people have named Doggerland, a stretch of fertile earth that once connected England with mainland Europe. Rivers ran across it, forests grew, herds grazed. People, too, likely lived there, carrying lives now lost to rising waters at the end of the last ice age. Today, all of Doggerland lies under 40 meters of cold sea, its memory reduced to fragments brought up in fishing nets. Tools chipped from stone, bones of mammoth and deer, reminders that land and life once filled the place where waves now pass without pause. How many other Doggerlands lay hidden in silence, unknown, unrecovered? The Mediterranean holds its forgotten shores as well. In ages when global waters retreated, it shrank into salt-encrusted basins, exposing immense canyons at the mouths of ancient rivers. The Nile once carved a gorge deeper than the Grand Canyon, now drowned beneath layers of sediment under Alexandria's harbor. What landscapes, what entire ecologies are still buried there, locked under slabs of stone and silt? And could it be that whole worlds are drowned not by catastrophe, but by the slow inevitability of water's return? Even as we lose coastlines to modern rising seas, the ocean reminds us that this is nothing new. It has taken, again and again, swallowing shore after shore in a cycle so ancient it cannot be measured in years, only in breaths of glaciers rising and melting. What we see as tragedy may simply be the continuation of a rhythm the planet has always kept. Still, we cannot help but feel the ghost of lands untouched by our eyes, memories trapped a mere few hundred feet below, close, yet impossible for us to walk again. And then questions drift in, quiet as the tide. What lives might have called those forgotten shores home? How many human cultures rose at the edges of coasts now drowned before they ever left behind histories we could read? Could entire forgotten epics of civilization linger in shallow seas, erased before they had the chance to be preserved? Maybe, maybe not. Yet the silence of absence is as haunting as discovery. To know that shorelines, where breath and tide intertwine, have existed far beyond our imagination is to accept that we will never hold the full story. Geology shows us the drowned evidence. River canyons that vanish into ocean basins, ripple marks preserved miles from any modern coast, terraces etched step by step into underwater cliffs, showing exactly how quickly oceans rose. They are layers of memory that do not speak loudly, but that still insist. The world you know has already been many worlds before. The continents are not fixed stage floors, but actors themselves, shifting their outlines, shedding their coasts. And in this unsteadiness lies an unsettling thought. If nearly every coastline we know has existed in another place, in another shape, in another age, then what does home even mean? Perhaps what we call homeland is only a temporary illusion, a pause in water's restless advance. Even the most familiar shore will one day sink into forgotten memory, joining the chorus of drowned places scattered across the globe, silent but without end. And yet, if the forgotten shores reveal whole landscapes lost to the ocean's patience, what deeper stories still lie folded into the very basins of the sea, where planetary memory itself seems to stretch and shift with every cycle? Perhaps the answer is that the oceans themselves are Earth's memory, not just of coasts and rivers, but of the planet's very identity. For in their depths lies a shifting archive, recording fire and ice, silence and storm, impacts that shook the crust, volcanoes that painted skies, even the gentle, imperceptible tilt of Earth's axis as it wanders across tens of thousands of years. The seas remember not as we do, with words and faces, but with chemistry, with sediments, with cycles etched upon their endless movements. In this way, oceans form a planetary self-portrait, one never still, but always in the act of becoming. Consider the memory of impact. 66 million years ago, a meteor struck the Yucatan, a force beyond comprehension. The land bore the crater, but the oceans carried the longer memory, spreading dust and ash, altering currents, collapsing food chains. This fingerprint, scattered across the globe, rests deep in ocean sediments as a thin boundary of iridium, a single, slender layer that divided worlds, sealing the end of the dinosaurs and the rise of mammals. To hold a core sample that crosses this line is to touch the scar of the planet itself. Preserved not in story but in chemistry, water's impartial memory widened into stone. But the oceans remember gentler forces too. Volcanoes, rising from beneath, writing their breath in ashes that drifted down into waves, embedding themselves in layers of clay. Even eruptions on land are mirrored by isotopes altered in the seas, as rivers washed minerals into their basins and currents carried them outward. Black shales hold the marks of suffocating seas, while chalk beds, built from blooms of plankton, speak of times when life surged, painting oceans white with shells before collapsing again. Could it be that every ripple, every change, every brief bloom or extinguishing is captured somewhere, folded into water's restless cycles? Even Earth's axis, the invisible lean of the planet, leaves its quiet trail. The tilt shifts, wobbles, dances over tens of thousands of years, changing the strength of seasons, redrawing circulation of ocean and air. These cycles, called Milankovitch rhythms, are not myths or guesses. They are stamped into layers of sand and mud beneath the sea. Warm ages carry one isotope balance. Ice ages carry another, alternating like chords on the strings of deep time. To read them is to realize that oceans are not just record keepers. They are participants, translating the tilt of the planet into climate, into landscapes, into life and death repeated in rhythm. Oceans do not just reflect memory. They create it over and over by carrying Earth's internal shifts into motion. It is tempting to think of memory as permanence, something unaltered. But the oceans resist this. Their memory is never single or exact. It is layered, overprinted, blurred. Impacts sit atop volcanic ash, which sits atop fossil blooms. No story is clean. All are mixed, reworked by currents, erased in places and added in others. Perhaps what makes the ocean's memory uncanny is precisely this lack of clarity. Not because it conceals truth, but because it embodies the truth of change, that nothing stands outside of motion, that even memory itself must shift like water to survive. Could it be, then, that the oceans function like a dream, that they do not recount, but reinterpret, carrying fragments of impacts, fragments of ice, fragments of extinct life, gathering them into patterns we can never reconstruct fully? To study isotopes is to listen at the edges of whispers, piecing together echoes from countless overlaps. It humbles us into recognizing that planetary memory is not like human memory. It does not select meaning, it does not prioritize importance. Keeps everything but in a blurred, interwoven form so the picture is never still, never wholly clear. And yet, in these blurs, something revealing emerges. We begin to see that Earth itself has an identity beyond continents, beyond forests, beyond species. It is not fixed. It is perpetually defined and redefined in cycles of remembering and forgetting carried by water. Ocean cores show not only what Earth has been, but also what rhythms it insists on repeating: warmth and cooling, bloom and suffocation, collapse and renewal. Perhaps this is why we feel a strange reassurance when looking out over the sea. Somewhere in us, we recognize that these waves carry the very pulse of the planet, the slow heartbeat of deep time. Imagine for a moment that the ocean is not only an archive, but an active memory, a self-portrait Earth paints on itself again and again. Continents may drift, skies may change, forests may burn, but always the oceans record these shifts by adjusting their chemistry, their cycles, their sediment. We live on a world drawing itself continually, line after line, never allowing a final image to stand. It is both humbling and wondrous to think that we are not outside this memory, but part of it. Our carbon, our dust, even our plastics becoming layers in the same restless portrait. And yet, if oceans hold the memory of Earth itself, And if their records are forever painted over with new layers, what mirror do they offer us in return? What reflection of our own fleeting time appears across those restless waters? When we gaze at the seas today, we are not only looking into a window onto the ancient past. We are looking at a mirror held to our faces, one that reveals not what is eternal, but what is momentary. Our presence, our movements, our consequences, shimmering lightly across a surface that will one day forget us. The seas are rising again, not suddenly, not in the scale of one night, but steadily, season by season, tide by tide. Glaciers that once seemed immovable are flowing now faster than they have in centuries, and their disappearance breathes back into the oceans, lifting water higher upon the shorelines where millions of us live. For us, it feels recent, urgent, a shift tied to industry, carbon, heat. But from the ocean's perspective, it is continuation, another rhythm in an endless sequence of advances and retreats. It mirrors both the cycles deeper than we can measure and the sharp acceleration which is our particular footprint. The ocean does not choose what it reflects. It accepts. Water is patient, but relentless. It obeys gravity, pressure, heat. It does not hurry, yet it never stops. This is why coasts retreat, not in waves crashing in a single storm, but in the slow, incremental gnawing of tide. This is why ice vanishes, not in sudden collapse alone, but in the warmer reach of decade upon decade. It is not cruelty, but inevitability. Still, in its inevitability, we find ourselves mirrored. Because in the seas rising now, we confront a truth both intimate and humbling, that we are not separate from the planet's changes. We are inscribed within them. Could it be that our era will one day be remembered in layers of stone as only a faint line enriched with plastics and altered isotopes? Our entire legacy reduced to an archive band no thicker than a hand's breadth? The ocean does not tell us moral lessons, and yet in its reflection we sense one. For every city with its shoreline lit at night, for every stretch of land we try to fix against the advancing tide, we are reminded of impermanence. The ocean shows us not permanence but passage, not safety but cycle, and maybe in that cycle there is something more profound than permanence could ever give. For permanence is an illusion, but cycle is true. What returns may not be the same, but it always returns, in form or in fragment, in story or silence. Scientists measure this mirror with precision. They track isotopes of carbon in the air, temperatures rising in the deep sea, currents shifting against baselines known for centuries. They core ice and sediments, pulling whispers of history into their hands, comparing now with then. And what they find is that the present is not exceptional in experiencing change. Earth has changed countless times, but it is exceptional in how swiftly. Our imprint appears in centuries rather than millennia, in decades rather than epochs. The ocean reflects that hastening back to us, its tides arriving the same as ever, but creeping higher in ways subtle yet undeniable. And so, in this reflection, we are asked silently, what does it mean to exist here, now, at the edge of seas that are shifting in our lifetimes? What does it mean to know we are part of a record so vast, yet so fleeting, our chapter pressed into archives where nearly all details will wash away? Could it be that our essence is not in what we keep, but in how we change, knowingly or not, the symmetries around us? Perhaps this is why the ocean holds such sway over our imaginations, because to look at it is to see both permanence and impermanence at once, a body that has always been here and that carries within it the proof that nothing has ever truly stayed the same. The ocean's mirror reflects us not as we wish ourselves to be, but as we are, temporary, swept forward, written into history by forces beyond our control, yet allowed in this moment to look back at ourselves in wonder. And yet, if the reflection of our own fleeting age is already pressed into the sea, what might the future oceans tell of other civilizations, those that sank before memory, or those still hidden, buried beneath depths we have yet to uncover? It is here that we drift from the sure ground of geology into softer terrain, where science and speculation lean toward one another. For the ocean hides landscapes that were once dry, valleys that held rivers, plains where animals and perhaps even humans walked. And in those drowned places, we imagine, could there have been cities before ours, etched along shorelines that no longer exist, cultures swallowed as waters rose and tides returned? All around the world there are fragments that stir this question. Columns and walls found beneath the Mediterranean, pavements that lie deep under Caribbean waves, strange rectilinear ridges off the coast of Japan at Yonaguni. Some are natural, the work of stone and erosion, their shapes mimicking architecture. Others are real ruins, harbors and temples, once coastal, now submerged by earthquakes or centuries of rising seas. Science is careful, cautious, as it should be. But imagination widens when confronted with such silences. Could entire cities lie beneath the blue, forgotten not because they never existed, but because the ocean is so ruthless an eraser? Civilizations rise by the sea, and the sea never keeps promises to protect. What we know is this: coastlines are temporary, and every culture that leans too close to them has written its fate in tides. At the end of the last ice age, waters rose more than 400 feet. Lands like Doggerland in the North Sea vanished, taking with them entire ways of life. The Sunda Shelf beneath Indonesia was once forest and plain, now hidden as archipelago. In India's Gulf of Khumbat, sonar has revealed patterns like avenues and walls, debated endlessly but never confirmed. For every such place we glimpse, countless others lie undiscovered beneath silt, sand, and the long patience of water. Entropy ensures the ocean does not easily preserve. Stone collapses, wood dissolves, traces scatter. If there were cities before the ones we know, very little would remain. But little is enough to spark wonder. Could it be that we are not the first to stand on shores and believe our cities permanent? That other peoples, older than memory, built harbors, villages, monuments we will never know, swept away before they could write stone into history. Their traces, if they existed, might lie in only faint scatters of tools, fragments too weathered to distinguish, whispers so faint they blur with geology itself. Maybe they never were. Maybe the sea stirs only our longing, not our memory. But still, the question endures, riding the silence of the seafloor like an echo without source. And there is something deeply poetic in the ocean's refusal to confirm. The seas hide, but they do not speak quickly. They press everything into silence that deepens with depth, muting voices into dust. For science, this is frustrating. For imagination, it is fertile. We wonder because we do not know, and perhaps we are drawn to water for exactly this reason. Because beneath it are places no eye has seen since they drowned, and in that absence, anything feels possible. Unreal truths, lost epochs, civilizations sealed away not in myth, but in silt. But let us linger on what is real. Oceanographers map the drowned valleys with sonar, finding buried rivers far below the current sea level, canyons that once held flowing water, deltas marked in stone. Geologists mark terraces, former beaches now drowned, etched step by step as seas lifted over millennia. These are not speculation. They are proof that coasts rewrite themselves, shifting so completely that maps become ephemeral sketches. Humanity, with its brief presence, has often placed itself at the edges of seas, drawn by their abundance. But abundance is the very tether that pulls us closer to erasure. For the ocean, patient and impartial, always reclaims its edges. Entropy again is the author, not because it despises memory, but because dispersal is the law of time. Structures fall, currents carry fragments, coral grows over stone, disguising it as reef. Silt covers walls until they merge with seabeds indistinguishable from geology. Perhaps what we call submerged civilizations are less deliberate ruins and more the natural merging of memory back into nature. The sea does not mind if we cannot tell the difference. And yet, something in us keeps asking. Standing at a shoreline, gazing into dark water, we wonder what lies beneath not only as science, but as longing. Maybe the idea of lost cities resonates because it mirrors our own fragility. To imagine past civilizations drowned is to imagine our future reflected back. Could it be that their silence beneath the waves is not just their fate, but a rehearsal for ours? And yet, if cities, cultures, even whole histories can slip quietly beneath the water's surface, leaving only whispers for imagination to fill, what of smaller things? the grains of dust adrift on the wind, each one a piece of forgotten land, returning again and again to the waiting sea. For dust is the planet's most patient traveler. It carries with it fragments of mountains long eroded, forests long burned, even the faint memory of creatures ground into nothing more than particles too small for the eye to linger upon. Dust is exile, but it is also messenger. It leaves, but it never vanishes. From the Sahara, storms lift iron-rich grains high into the atmosphere, scattering them across oceans thousands of miles away. They drift over waves for weeks, moving across entire horizons until at last they settle gently into blue depths. In this quiet drift, deserts feed oceans. The plankton that build the foundation of marine life rely on that iron as spark, as nourishment, as breath. Every small particle becomes a gift, sustaining invisible forests of microscopic life that, in turn, sustain nearly everything else. Dust, then, is not just memory carried from one place to another. It is the bridge between land and sea, between silence and motion, between death and renewal. Other kinds of dust carry different stories. There is volcanic dust, thrown into the sky during eruptions, ash that holds traces of lava, echoes of mantle rising to surface. Each eruption embeds its soot into distant sediments, becoming thin black lines that mark precisely when the earth exhaled fire. There is pollen too, carried on the wind, grains from forests now gone. They tell of what grew where, of climates wetter or drier, of ecosystems that flourished or fell. Found in ocean cores, they remind us that every gust of wind leaves a trace. Every leaf, every tree, scattering memory like tiny seeds over waters that will one day bury them in silt. These grains may seem meaningless at first, too small to matter, too quiet to speak. Yet over millennia, layer upon layer, they become archives vast enough to span continents. Ocean sediments are filled with them, each grain heavy with a past it did not choose, yet willing to travel to its final resting place. Could it be that dust is Earth's most honest testimony? Not shaped by human hand, not arranged deliberately like stone carvings or artifacts, but carried freely, without choice, to wherever wind and water take it. Perhaps meaning itself emerges not from what we intend to preserve, but from what is scattered in silence. And here, entropy again reveals its poetry. Dust does not keep its identity. A mountain becomes sand. Sand becomes silt. Silt becomes clay drifting into abyssal plains. Individual forms are erased, yet together, they compose something enduring. They accumulate, not loudly, but patiently, forming the bulk of archives deep below. If fossils are outlines of individual lives, then dust is the outline of the planet itself, breaking down and dispersing all that ever stood. Not because it resists time, but because it yields to it completely. Perhaps this is why, when we stand in windstorms or wipe a layer of fine particles from bookshelves, something in us feels haunted. Dust is a reminder of impermanence, that everything becomes it eventually. Bone becomes dust. Stone becomes dust. Even cities, even civilizations. And from there, all of it drifts toward the sea. Memory, it seems, is granular before it vanishes into silence. In every ocean core, we find dunes collapsed into clay, volcanic towers sifted into ash, pollen scattered from forests long forgotten. Every grain is a messenger of what once was, now laid into blue depths where they will never return. Perhaps all lands one day are fated to become little piles of dust at the ocean's floor, an offering from continents to the water that wears them down. And yet, if dust is always carried onward, if all land tends inevitably towards scattering into sea, what of the oceans themselves? For even their most solid floors are not still plains of burial, but restless rifts where fire and stone rise, spreading valleys that sing of beginnings as much as endings. Deep below the quiet sway of waves, there are ridges stretching like unhealed seams across the globe. They appear, at first, like scars, dark lines where the crust is broken, split open. Yet they are not scars at all. They are births, mid-ocean ridges, rising from fire, exhaling into waters that are both cradle and witness. Here the earth seems to hum softly to itself, a hymn of ongoing creation. The seafloor at these valleys is always new. Magma wells upward from the mantle, cooling instantly in the press of water, hardening into black rock that soon becomes landscape. Day by day, year by year, the crust spreads outward, carrying continents gently apart, like pages separating in a book that is still being written. The oceans hold memory, but they also reset it. In these spreading centers, new pages are crafted from below, fresh and unwritten, ready to receive the sediments and fossils and dust of ages yet unborn. Could it be that this is how the planet balances itself, erasing vast pages through subduction, while inscribing new ones here, in fire softened by water? What is most extraordinary is that these mid-ocean ridges are among the longest mountain ranges on Earth. Yet they live hidden. We do not see them stretching across our maps, though their length dwarfs the Himalayas many times over. Upon them, hydrothermal vents exhale mineral-rich plumes, staining the waters black or white, clouds heavy with the chemistry of origins. Life clings to these offerings, forming unique ecosystems. Worms without mouths, shrimp without eyes, communities thriving without sunlight, nourished instead by Earth's molten breath. It is as if, in these fractures, ancient memory still stirs, reminding us of a time when fire and ocean together coaxed life into being. Not an echo of catastrophe, but of creation. The rocks that form at these ridges keep their own record. They cool aligned with magnetic fields, locking into themselves the orientation of Earth's poles. And since the poles wander, even reverse, the rocks reveal stripes of alternating polarity, silent tapestries that allow geologists to trace back the rhythm of Earth's shifting fields, like heartbeat after heartbeat cut into stone. The ridges hum with creation, but they also whisper the planet's deeper mysteries, its cycles of magnetism, its restless stirring beneath crust and sea. What other stories might they still be keeping? It humbles us to know that while mountains rise on land slowly, crumbling as they grow, the ocean's mountains rise ceaselessly, extending outward year after year beneath the water where no eye can watch. Creation here is not dramatic. It is hidden, unhurried, unannounced, and yet it never stops. Maybe that is how all lasting creation works. Not in proclaiming itself, but in continuing quietly, endlessly, until the world shapes itself around it. When we think of valleys, we usually think of silence, of hollows where rivers once cut through hills. But rift valleys at the centers of oceans are not silence. They are voices, low, deep, steady voices singing of renewal, though we mistake them for scars from above. The planet does not see them as wounds. It sees them as breathing spaces, places where its interior can rise, expand, and meet the sea. We name them valleys, but perhaps they are better thought of as thresholds, boundaries where what was hidden emerges, shaping what is to come. And so, the ocean floor is not only memory. It is movement. It is song. It does not merely wait for what falls from above. It rises, participates, begins new layers of history even as it swallows older ones in trenches. In this deep choreography, the seas remind us again that permanence is mistaken. Nothing is ever fixed. Everything flows, including the ground beneath what feels most secure. Maybe this is why the ocean feels so endless to us, because it is the one place where both memory and birth are entangled, each folded into the other continuously across deep time. And yet, if the ridges beneath us sing of beginnings, what of the ocean's surface, where beginnings quietly feed every breath we take, unseen forests drifting not in soil, but in light and plankton floating like invisible sky? For above the ridges, above the trenches, above the shifting tides, there is another world, delicate yet immense, a realm of plankton, too small to be noticed, yet vast enough to keep us alive. These tiny drifters, floating in currents, form something greater than redwoods, greater than rainforests, greater even than the continents they encircle, the ocean's sky. Plankton are not trees, yet they act like trees. They rise and fall with sunlight, carrying the rhythm of day into the deep. With each flicker of photosynthesis, they release oxygen, sending it into water and air, into currents that touch every living breath. Every second, invisible clouds of oxygen stream upward, unseen, uncelebrated, but utterly essential. More than half the air filling our lungs right now may have come from them, quiet offerings from the ocean's smallest inhabitants. Could it be that when we walk through forests or watch leaves stir in wind, we are only noticing half the gift, while the other half, just as vital, floats invisibly in the blue, far from our sight? These plankton are as ancient as the ocean itself. Fossils of tiny foraminifera and diatoms lie pressed into sediments, their chemical signatures still whispering the climates they lived through, the atmospheres they helped craft. They are both present tense and deep-time archive, feeding, exhaling, dying today while also leaving silent records for millions of years to come. Every layer of ocean floor is sprinkled with their remains, like accumulated stars falling into darkness. Could it be that this is Earth's true memory, millions upon millions of small lives, building oxygen with patience, their legacy pressed into stone far below? Not because any chose to write it, but because life itself cannot help but leave traces. In their abundance, they remind us of scale. We often measure life by size, the height of sequoias, the expanse of grasslands. Yet, in the oceans, life measures its dominance by multitude. Each plankton is a fraction, but in their trillions they form the planet's breath. Entropy will one day erase individuals, scatter outlines, break molecules apart. But for so long as they exist in number, they overwhelm dissolution with sheer persistence. They thrive by letting go of individuality, surrendering importance to the collective rhythm of drift. Maybe there is a lesson in that meaning need not come from the single and permanent, but from the many and fleeting, repeated again and again until permanence emerges. And still, plankton hold their mysteries. Sometimes they gather in blooms so vast they can be seen from space. Emerald spirals painted across oceans, glowing with chlorophyll like brushstrokes on a blue canvas. These bursts shift oxygen suddenly, alter carbon flows, change the chemistry of the sea and the air at once. They seem like breath made visible, whole lungs of the earth exhaling at scales we cannot fathom. Then, as quickly as they appear, they vanish, sinking to the depths, feeding new cycles. Continuous, unending, unseen. Our survival hidden in the smallest drifters of the sea. Perhaps this is why, when we breathe deeply, the air feels older than ourselves. Because it is. It carries within it molecules once released by plankton hundreds of miles away, maybe hundreds of years ago, rising up from invisible forests of the sea. For every inhale and exhale we make, there is a balancing exhale and inhale deep in the blue. We do not see it, but we participate in it. Life is not just ours. It is theirs and all the others too small to name. And yet, if the ocean sky above us is what fills our lungs, then what waits below, hidden still deeper, at the edges of trenches where even air cannot reach, where silence, not breath, becomes the way of life? To descend here is to leave behind everything that feels familiar. Light vanishes long before we touch the bottom. Sound fades until only the hum of pressure remains. And at last, on the trench floors where the crust folds into itself, silence rules. A silence older than sunlight. A silence that endures no matter what lives or what vanishes. Here, pressure is nearly unimaginable. Every square inch weighed down by tons of water, crushing with a force that would flatten us before a heartbeat had passed. And yet, against this impossible gravity, life clings. Not in abundance, not in flamboyance, but in quiet persistence. Pale creatures shape themselves to survive without light, without warmth from the sun, relying instead on the faint heat escaping from fractures in the crust, or the slow rain of organic matter drifting down from distant surface worlds. They are lives untethered from the sky, made for a place where silence is more constant than time itself. Consider the amphipods, tiny crustaceans found at the deepest trenches. They drift and feed on what little arrives, their bodies adapted to chemical balances that would dissolve the tissues of surface creatures. Or the snailfish, translucent and ghost-like, found at depths once assumed impossible. Each form here bends around crushing constraints, but instead of breaking, it changes. Could it be that silence itself reshapes existence, training life to speak more softly, to endure with less, to continue on invisible paths? The floor of the trench is not empty. It is covered with sediments, miles deep in some places, thick with the memories of all that has fallen. Dust, plankton shells, fragments of bone, ash from volcanoes, all pressed together in a graveyard of time. Here, the archives of Earth are at their deepest, layered so slowly that a footstep would not disturb them for centuries. To touch this sediment is to touch the quiet handwriting of deep time itself, written not in script, but in patience. And still, the trenches are not only places of burial. They are the Earth's great recyclers, mouths where crust disappears. Here, seafloor sediments are driven downwards, subduction zones drawing whole archives back into Earth's molten interior. What went silent in the deep will one day roar again as flames in volcanoes, as new rock pressed upward, as gases reshaping atmosphere. Entropy here is not ending, but transition, an erasure that is also a recreation. The silence of trenches is deceptive, for beneath it is motion, beneath it is fire, beneath it is memory remade. It is almost unimaginable for us, standing within a world so dependent on sunlight, to realize that whole ecosystems thrive without it. Hydrothermal vent fields arise even within these abyssal blacknesses, exhaling warmth and minerals into the void, creating islands of life around them. Tube worms extend like fragile flutes, clams cluster tight, bacteria perform chemistry that turns rock into sustenance. This is life at its edge, not grand, but profound. Not because it resembles us, but because it entirely does not. Life here has no use for sky, no use for photosynthesis. It reminds us that existence itself is adaptable beyond imagination. Maybe, then, the silence of the trenches is not the silence of death, but of difference. An alternate way of being, stripped of the constants we associate with life. Could it be that somewhere else, on distant exoplanets, there are oceans without sunlight that look more like these trenches than our surface seas? And if so, might our deepest places be echoes of other worlds, whispers that we are not alone in the universe, but part of a larger pattern life has always leaned toward? The deepest ocean may be Earth's best mirror for cosmic possibility. And yet, we wonder, do these silences remember? Does time mean anything to the creatures that live without a day or night? To them, perhaps eternity is reduced to chemistry, and change is measured not in seasons but in molecules. Still, sediments gather above them, recording their patience, catching the outlines of shells and bones that drift down, pressing them into archives for the ages. Silence, once more, becomes the substance of memory itself. Perhaps that is the greatest truth of the edges of silence, that they do not remove life, but reshape it. Not into abundance, but into resilience. Not into voice, but into whisper. And in those whispers, buried under crushing black, Earth continues to speak, even if we are seldom there to listen. And yet, if this silence can cradle life unseen, if trenches preserve both death and endurance, what might the ocean hold after us, when our voices finally vanish into the same dark patience of time? It is a question both humbling and inevitable, for the seas have buried nearly everything before us. Forests, mountains, entire civilizations carved only in bone and shell. And one day they will bury us as well. Whether by slow retreat or sudden collapse, by tide or entropy, our impressions will fade, becoming fragments pressed into the sediments of a planet that has already folded away far greater histories. The ocean will make an archive of us, too, though its memory will not be the story we intended to write. Perhaps the most enduring traces of our presence will not be monuments, nor books, nor images carved into stone, but more ordinary things. Shells of buildings shattered and drowned on coastlines. Iron and steel scattered like new fossils. Plastics, polymers, resistant fabrics drifting across currents until at last they settle, layered into sediments alongside dead plankton and grains of dust. The ocean does not discriminate. It accepts crumbling fossils and bottle caps alike, layering them into the same future stone. One day, some unimaginable geologist, human or otherwise, might peel open strata to find bones pressed beside plastic, mollusk shells fused to melted glass. A hybrid archive of biology and technology, our technofossil record, immortal not by intent, but by accident. What story would these traces tell? Perhaps only this, that we lived quickly, altering more in a few centuries than most creatures could in a million years. The isotope ratios will bear this out as well: carbon, nitrogen, sulfur shifting suddenly, marking the Anthropocene like a scar, a sharp line as clear as an asteroid's impact or a great extinction. Oceans will hold this signature long after we are gone, etched not in words but in chemistry. They will not tell who we were in detail, but they will tell that we were, that a presence once blurred the balance of the planet's breathing. Could it be that this is the truest form of memory, that Earth does not record individuality, but consequence? Entropy ensures our traces will scatter. Our cities will fall to tides, their fragments buried or carried out. Our bones will be rare fossils, as all bones are, and the names we give ourselves will vanish entirely. But our chemistry will linger. The altered salinity of seas, the microplastics entwined in plankton shells, the radioactive isotopes of a brief nuclear age, all will remain, scattered, awaiting transformation. Memory does not vanish, only disperses. And so, the ocean keeps even us, whether we wish it to or not. And in our absence, life will continue as it always has after losses. Coral will reclaim ruins, weaving reefs among toppled harbors. Fish will swim through windows once filled with glass, making homes within decay. Without our interference, currents may rediscover balances long disrupted. Blooms of plankton may shift, whales may drift along freer paths. The sea, which has always remade itself from extinction, will remake itself again. Our fragments may sink, but new ecologies will rise, indifferent to what they rest upon. And yet we might wonder, will the oceans remember us kindly? Not because they forgive or condemn, water holds no judgment, but because what we leave pressed into them will be ambiguous. Will our traces be misinterpreted as signs of another extinction, abrupt and dramatic, or as some strange flowering of matter that quickly fell away? Maybe even the memory of us will be blurred, part of the ocean's constant layering of creation and erasure. The way volcanoes and ice ages are remembered not through detail, but through impact. Perhaps that is the quietest answer. The ocean will remember us only as it remembers everything else, not as we see ourselves, but as cycles, as residues, as chemistry dissolving into broader patterns of time. No single story, no name, no poem endures. What endures instead are elements, rearranged and pressed forward into future epochs. We will live again, not as civilization, but as grains of dust mixed in stone, as chemical whispers in isotopes carried far into the future. And maybe that is enough. Maybe being remembered indistinctly is part of belonging, part of returning to the same endless rhythm from which all things emerged. We cannot seed eternity, but we can join it. And in being scattered into water, into the patience of sediment, we become as much a part of ocean memory as the trilobites, as the ammonites, as the forests and ashes before us. And yet, if the ocean after us carries our fragments into new archives, what will become of the oceans themselves when even water, patient as it is, returns at last to the sky, evaporated under the swollen sun that waits in Earth's distant future? For as eternal as the sea feels, it is not eternal. Time reaches further than even water's vast memory. One day, perhaps billions of years from now, the oceans may vanish, dissolving back into vapor, leaving Earth to remember water only as absence. To imagine that distant Earth is to imagine a home unrecognizable. The sun, now steady and warm, will swell brighter, hotter, heavier in its reach. Slowly, almost indiscernibly at first, heat will rise. Lakes will vanish. Rivers will retreat. Glaciers, the great breathers of ice, will dissolve completely. The seas will shrink, drawn upward into the atmosphere, transformed into clouds swollen beyond anything the planet has ever known. At last, even the deepest trenches will be dry, nothing but stone cracked by heat, their silence deeper for lacking water. A world once cradled in blue will be scorched gray, barren, stripped of its veil of oceans. What if oceans, which have been the storytellers of Earth since its beginnings, are destined in the end to leave no story at all? The science already stirs beneath this vision. Astronomers tell us that stars like our sun age. They burn hotter as they grow older, their cores changing, their light intensifying until the delicate balance that keeps Earth comfortable collapses. Geologists tell us that as oceans vaporize, hydrogen will slip into space, leaked into the endless dark, never returning. Slowly, Earth will lose not only its seas, but its very capacity to remember them, like a mind erasing its most defining memory. Could it be that the last act of our planet is to forget the waters that once defined it? And yet ocean memory will not vanish all at once. It will linger in stone, in salt flats where seas once lay, in calcium pressed into fossilized reefs that remain even after water has gone. The ghost of water will be everywhere, etched into valleys carved by waves, written into layered sediments that once sank below tides. Even in absence, oceans will leave their outlines behind, echoes of a story that can be imagined, if not relived. Perhaps Earth's last seas will exist mostly in the imagination of what remains to witness them, dissolving before eyes that cannot keep them in place. Without water, entropy will accelerate. Rocks will weather without replenishment, soils will dry, life, if any persists, will shrink into niches unimaginable to us now. Memory will compress not into sediments beneath oceans, but into dust blown endlessly into red skies. Planetary history will trade water's language of preservation for the brittle silence of a desert planet. Could it be that one day, Earth itself will look much like the worlds we already see around us? Mars, scorched and cold, or Venus, boiling and thick, both of them perhaps once touched by seas that are now long gone? If so, then oceans are not only Earth's story, but a stage in a larger cosmic pattern. The rise, flourishing, and loss of water across planetary time. But even in this bleak imagining, there is still wonder, because the vapor that rises may not be lost entirely. Some could linger in the atmosphere, scattering light into strange shades of blue. Some will escape into space, traceable billions of years later as signals to distant wanderers, whispers that once, around this dimming star, a planet lived and breathed with oceans. Perhaps Earth's final archive will not be in sediment or stone, but in space itself, its molecules scattered among the stars. Water that was once here, that once churned in our veins and surged in waves, may drift into the cosmos to become part of other worlds. Nothing is destroyed, only moved beyond recognition, beyond recall. And in that thought lingers a softer question. Is absence itself not another form of memory? If one were to stand on the last dry basin of a vanished sea, would they not feel the presence of what had been, even as it was gone? Could empty oceans hold stories simply by their silence, by the shapes they carved, by the hollows they left behind? Perhaps emptiness is not erasure. Perhaps it, too, is inscription. And yet, if oceans themselves may someday dissolve back into vapor, leaving Earth to remember only by absence, then what shoreline of memory will remain for us to walk? What fragile edge will be left when the sea's rhythm has withdrawn into silence forever? Perhaps the answer lies in the shore itself, in the place where worlds meet, always temporary, always shifting, yet endlessly returning. Every tide that rolls in carries with it the subtle power of revision. It smooths what was jagged, pulls away what was written, leaves fragments that seem permanent only until the next wave arrives. To stand at the shoreline is to watch memory being made and unmade before your eyes, too quickly to hold, too slowly to pin down. We associate memory with permanence. Photographs, inscriptions, fossils pressed into stone. Yet the shoreline teaches us another truth. Memory is not kept, but remade. The sand you walk upon is never the same twice, although it appears steady at a glance. The lines drawn by foam vanish within seconds, replaced by others that vanish too. What trace remains, if any, is diffuse. A single shell, a shimmer of wet sand, the faint curve of driftwood. Could it be that our own thoughts, our recollections, the fabric of who we believe ourselves to be, are more like shorelines than like monuments? Mutable, shifting with time's repeated waves, reshaped until they no longer resemble how they began. Geology confirms what our eyes already know. Coasts are impermanent. They advance and retreat with each age, carved by storms, rebuilt by rivers, drowned by rising seas. Entire villages thrive at a shoreline for generations, only to vanish within decades. Cliffs recede, sandbars migrate, estuaries widen or collapse. A coastline is not a boundary but a negotiation, the drawn sigh of time expressed in stone and water. Perhaps memory, too, is not a border, but a negotiation between what is kept and what is erased, between what lingers and what dissolves. And still, in their mutability, shorelines preserve. Layers of beach sands, buried and compacted, turn to sandstone, carrying ripple marks that once moved with tides. Shell fragments pressed deeper, fossilize within the stone. What looks like absence is often only transformation. Our memories may dissolve from the surface of the mind, but deep within, outlines remain, sometimes resurfacing unexpectedly, like a shell washed up after years at sea. They remind us that nothing truly disappears. It only shifts layers, buried in silence until uncovered again. Consider how the tides remember with rhythm but forget with detail. They are faithful to their pulse, rising and falling predictably, yet faithless to their shape, changing the shore each time. In the same way, we remember rhythms, patterns that define us, the voice of someone we loved, the feeling of standing as a child by the sea. Yet the details shift, fade, blur. Not because they failed, but because memory itself is oceanic, bound not by permanence but by process. Could it be, then, that the most honest form of remembering is not to cling to detail but to accept erosion? To let memory shift and reshape itself naturally, the way no wave resists its own dissolution. Entropy is patient here. Each advancing tide disperses what was gathered. A tidal pool teeming with life one day may appear empty the next. Driftwood rests for weeks and then disappears, carried elsewhere. Just as entropy spreads molecules into wider arrangements, tides spread memory across currents, deliver it to places far away, scatter it into forms unrecognizable. Perhaps the scattering, the surrender to dispersal, is not a weakness of memory, but its true essence, to fold us back not into what we have been, but into the larger cycles of what is shared. And yet, there is beauty in the wistfulness of shorelines. To watch them is to watch impermanence made visible. Every shell left one day is gone the next. Every footprint lasts only until the water decides to take it. Every pattern the foam arranges is already destined to vanish. And still we go there, still we stand, still we return, compelled by something in us that recognizes our own nature in this fleeting stage. We too are shorelines. We too are temporary lines drawn by the tide, no less fragile, no less wondrous. And yet, if memory, like the shoreline, is always rewritten, then what becomes of us when time itself withdraws not just the edges of our lives, but everything? When there are no more lines to redraw, only silence vast enough to swallow even oceans? There will come a day, distant but inevitable, when the seas no longer churn with tides, when the last waves fall back, and no water remains to carry memory forward. Extinction, drift, evaporation, all time points toward oceans emptied. And what then, if the beginning and the ending are both silence? It is difficult to imagine Earth without oceans, because the seas feel so eternal. They have accompanied every story we tell of this world, from the boiling crucibles of its birth to the soft rhythms of tides we stand beside now. Yet deep time reminds us that nothing is permanent. Just as mountains fall, as continents drift, as stars swell and vanish, the oceans too are impermanent. The sun will grow hotter, burning away their patience. Entropy will win, scattering water into vapor and vapor into space. The trenches will dry, the ridges will cool, and the seafloor will no longer sing. Silence will leak into every place water once filled, until Earth's memory folds inward on itself. But silence is not absence, it is presence of another kind. To drift into silence is to accept that the ocean's archives will eventually be erased. Fossils will subduct into molten mantle. Sediments will be lifted into mountains and then removed as dust. Carbon, nitrogen, oxygen. All the delicate ratios that told of blooms, extinctions, and breath will flatten into chemical uniformity, Strings of data written once vividly across seas dissolving into noise. Could it be that silence is not memory lost, but memory diffused so widely it cannot be spoken anymore? Think of extinction. Nearly every life that has existed is already gone, and yet something persists. Patterns reshaped, genes folded forward. What was alive does not vanish entirely, but reduces until it sits so quietly we no longer recognize it. The extinction of oceans might be much the same. To lose them does not mean the story never happened. It means the details have dissolved into silence so complete it no longer requires narration. Silence itself becomes the archive, and the archive does not need us to read it. Perhaps, then, the silence at the end mirrors the silence at the beginning. Before oceans gathered, before water wrapped the crust in blue, there was stillness. Stone cooling in emptiness, stars overhead burning. When seas vanish, they will leave behind a silence that feels strangely familiar. An ending that looks like an echo folded back into its origin. Maybe all of Earth's history is nothing more than the sound of silence being briefly interrupted. And yet, even in imagining this, another question emerges. Is silence truly empty, or does it hold within it the resonance of everything that came before? When we sit beside seas at night and catch ourselves holding still, listening to nothing but the quiet between waves, we sometimes feel that silence is not absence but fullness, a fullness too vast for the ear to capture. Could the same be true at the end of oceans? That their departure will not erase them, but spread them so wide they exist everywhere at once. Too thin to notice, too infinite to ignore. Entropy will scatter. Evaporation will rise. And what oceans leave us then may not be stone or sediment, but the memory of breath itself. Our atmosphere reshaped, our skies rewritten, and within them the faint, final echo of tides no longer returning. Time points toward this silence, yet time does not announce its scale. It could be billions of years. It could outlast us by ages upon ages. Still, we know it waits, just as we know that silence is always patient. Perhaps the most haunting wonder is that silence is the only certainty Earth has. In the beginning, it was here. In the end, it will return. Between those two spans lies everything. The tides, the fossils, the extinctions, the blooms, the whispers of isotopes, the drifting of continents, the breath of ice, the rhythms of tides, and us, each of us, brief, fragile interruptions in an ocean too vast for permanence. And yet, if silence will be all, if oceans will return to vapor and memory will scatter into absence, could it be that what remains is not erasure, but dreaming, that the sea itself dreamed once, and we were part of its restless imagining? This thought returns us gently, after such a vast journey, to where we began, with the question of what the ocean truly is. Not only water, not only archive, not only womb of life, but something stranger, something almost like a mind of the planet itself. What if the oceans dreamed of us? It is not a scientific question, not really. And yet, listening to water move over stones, or watching the endless rhythm of tides, it does not feel impossible. The ocean remembers in shells and sediments. It records climates in isotopes, extinctions in black shales, continents in drowned valleys. Its memory runs longer than any mountain, any forest, any civilization. But what if remembering was never only storage? What if remembering was something closer to imagining? An unending churn of fragments that, like dreams, swirl until patterns emerge. Perhaps life itself was such a pattern, shaken loose not by intent, but by the restless drifting of chemistry that only water could provide. In our blood is salt, echo of ancient tides. In our cells, water is matrix and medium, the necessity without which no thought or breath occurs. Could it be that even as individuals we are small extensions of the ocean's dreaming, tiny eddies of its larger imagination? Maybe that is why we are drawn so irresistibly back to its edge, standing at shorelines not just because the view is beautiful, but because on some level we are recognizing ourselves, reflecting on the dreamer that made us possible. The ocean dreams slowly. It does not hurry. Its visions unfold in billions of years. Molecules assembling into membranes, membranes into cells, cells into colonies that glow and drift. It does not plan. It does not direct. But like a dream, its currents carry one thought into another, one possibility into another, weaving fragments into forms more complex than chance would allow alone. Evolution, then, might feel not like a straight line but like a dream narrative, improbable, recursive, looping, and yet strangely coherent in hindsight. Dreams do not explain themselves, and neither does life. We wake within them and wonder how they began. And so we wonder, are we here to think, or are we here because the ocean thought in us? Every isotope preserved in shells, every dust grain drifting downward, every fossil crystallized in stone, all of them assemble into layers that outlast their beginnings. Perhaps we too are part of that layering, leaving behind fragments not because we chose to, but because the ocean dreamed us into being long enough to leave traces. And when we are gone, those traces will carry on regardless, like dream fragments echoing into a waking world. But if the ocean dreamed us, then why? Not for purpose, perhaps, but for rhythm. Not because meaning was intended, but because possibilities multiplied once chemistry had water as its canvas. Could it be that life, thought, even awareness are simply what happens when oceans spend long enough time turning themselves over? Perhaps consciousness is only water remembering itself in new forms. Not because it wanted to, but because that is what water does. It holds, it carries, it moves memory forward, wave by wave, shell by shell, thought by thought. This does not diminish us. If anything, it deepens us. To see ourselves as an echo of oceans is to recognize that we are part of something vast beyond identity, and yet deeply intimate. Every tear, every breath, every drop of blood within us is not just ours. It belongs to the same cycle that dreamt trilobites, ammonites, forests, whales. To be human might simply be to be a fleeting tide pooling on the shore, held briefly, then returned. Perhaps that is why the idea of the ocean dreaming us carries such quiet resonance. Because if it is true, then we are not strangers to Earth. We are not accidents upon it. We are its continuity. The sea looked inward, and for an instant, here we are. Eyes that can contemplate tides, ears that can hear waves at night, imaginations that can wonder at the silence waiting at the end. Maybe we are the ocean's way of feeling its own rhythms for a little while, of hearing itself remember. And if this is so, then the eventual silence, the evaporation, the scattering, the return of oceans to vapor, will not be ending alone. It will be closing of an eyelid, the soft drifting of a dreamer returning to rest. And we will have been part of that dream, carried along, forgotten in detail but somehow kept in essence, as all dreams are. And yet, if we are only a dream of oceans, what might other dreams look like? Could other planets, with seas larger or smaller, dream differently? Could life elsewhere be other variations of the same restless imagining, countless reflections of water remembering itself beneath other suns? We cannot know, but perhaps that is the final gift. To be part of one dream, however brief, is to imagine there are others. Endless oceans and endless skies, each dreaming in their own silence, as ours, too, fades back into rest.